The slap echoed through the boardroom like a gunshot. My own father, Thomas Bowen, CEO and patriarch, had just struck me across the face in front of the entire executive board. Not because I'd failed, not because I'd stolen or lied, but because I dared to tell the truth that my younger sister Grace had just signed a catastrophically bad $50 million contract that could bankrupt our family's company within a year. "You're suspended as CEO until you apologize to your sister," he said, his voice cold with contempt. "You've always been jealous of Grace, always trying to sabotage her." I stood there tasting blood, feeling the burn on my cheek, while Grace smirked from across the table. The board members looked away, cowards all of them, and for just a split second so brief, no one else noticed I smiled, because they had no idea what I'd been planning for 3 years. "Fine," I said simply. One word, no tears, no arguments, no begging, just fine. The next morning, Grace practically skipped into my office ready to gloat over my humiliation. Instead, she found it completely empty. Every file, every photo, every trace of me gone. Just a single envelope on the bare desk, my resignation letter. That's when our family lawyer burst through the door, his face white as death. "The $50 million contract, it's been canceled. The defense contractor says they'll only work with Natalie. And that's not all." What my father didn't know was that I wasn't just the CEO. I was the only thing holding this company together. And I'd just walked away. This is the story of how I destroyed everything my father built and rebuilt it better. But first, I had to let it all burn. My name is Natalie Bowen. I'm 33 years old, and until about 15 minutes ago, I was the interim CEO of Bowen Corp., the defense technology company my mother helped build 3 decades ago. I've spent the last 6 years of my life holding this company together with nothing but competence, endless nights, and the kind of quiet determination that gets overlooked in favor of louder, flashier performances. The slap echoed through the boardroom like a gunshot. I'd walked into that emergency board meeting knowing it would be difficult. Grace had done it again, signed a contract she barely understood, dazzled by the zeros and the prestige without bothering to read the actual terms. A $50 million defense contract with delivery timelines we couldn't possibly meet, and penalty clauses that would financially cripple us if we failed. I'd spent 72 sleepless hours with our legal team and engineers running the numbers, building the case, preparing the presentation that would prove what everyone in that room needed to hear: this contract would bankrupt Bowen Corp. Within 18 months. My father sat at the head of the mahogany table in the chair that used to be my mother's. His silver hair perfectly styled his expression, already set in that familiar mask of dismissive certainty. Thomas Bowen had always been obsessed with legacy, not the kind built through innovation or integrity, but the performative kind that looked good in business magazines and sounded impressive at country club dinners. To his right sat Grace, my 28-year-old sister, wearing a cream Chanel suit she'd charged to the company card and an expression of practiced confidence that had never quite reached her eyes. The other board members filled the remaining seats: Margaret Chen, who'd worked alongside my mother, and was one of the few people in that room with an actual conscience; Richard Sorensen, our CFO, who'd been steadily graying since Grace joined the executive team 3 years ago, and 6 others who'd long ago perfected the art of seeing only what was convenient. I stood at the presentation screen, remote control in hand. My navy suit pressed to perfection, every strand of dark hair pulled into the neat bun I'd learned made people take me more seriously. I clicked through the financial projections, the timeline analysis, the comparative data from similar contracts. My voice remained level, professional, stripped of anything that could be called emotional, as I explained exactly how Grace's signature on that contract had potentially destroyed everything our family had built. "The penalty clauses alone," I said, highlighting the relevant section on screen, "would trigger cascading financial obligations of approximately $73 million if we miss a single milestone. Grace committed us to a 12-month delivery schedule for technology that our engineering team estimates requires 18 to 24 months to develop safely." "Natalie's just being conservative," Grace interrupted, her voice carrying that same breezy confidence she used to charm clients before I had to quietly clean up the damage. The client loved my vision. They specifically said they wanted to work with someone who thinks big instead of someone who understands physics. I kept my tone neutral, but I saw Grace's cheeks flush. Grace, you promised them a weapons guidance system with specifications that violate 3 different laws of thermodynamics as currently written. Thomas's hand came down on the table hard enough to rattle the water glasses. That's enough, Natalie. Your sister secured the largest contract in company history, and all you can do is tear her down, just like always. I'd heard variations of this accusation my entire life, so the words themselves didn't surprise me. What caught my attention was the specific phrasing "just like always," which matched almost verbatim something I'd seen in an email Grace had accidentally forwarded to me 6 months ago, advice from someone she called a family friend and mentor, whose name she'd never mentioned. Someone who seemed to have Thomas's ear as well, judging by how often my father's criticisms echoed that mysterious advisor's language. "I'm not tearing her down," I said quietly. "I'm trying to save this company from a contractual obligation we cannot fulfill. You're trying to make your sister look incompetent because you're threatened by her success." Thomas leaned forward, and I saw something ugly flicker in his eyes, something that had been building for years, fed by whispers I couldn't trace. "Grace has vision. Grace has courage. All you have is spreadsheets and excuses." Margaret Chen cleared her throat. "Thomas, perhaps we should review Natalie's analysis before—" "We don't need to review anything except Natalie's attitude." My father stood, and the room went very quiet. "I'm tired of you sabotaging your sister. I'm tired of your jealousy poisoning this family." I could have argued. I had 43 slides of irrefutable data. I had emails from our lead engineer explicitly stating the timeline was impossible. I had legal opinions from 3 different attorneys warning about the penalty clauses. But as I looked at my father's face twisted with a certainty that had nothing to do with facts, I realized something I'd known on some level for a very long time. Evidence didn't matter. Truth didn't matter. I would never be what he wanted me to be, no matter how many disasters I prevented or how many messes I cleaned up. "Apologize to Grace," Thomas said, his voice low and dangerous. "Right now. Tell her you're sorry for undermining her achievement." The room held its collective breath. I saw Grace watching me with barely concealed satisfaction. I saw Richard Sorensen staring at his notepad, unable to meet my eyes. I saw Margaret Chen's face crumple with something that looked like grief. I opened my mouth to respond, and that's when my father's hand connected with my face. The sound seemed impossibly loud in the enclosed space. My head snapped to the side, and I felt the sharp sting spread across my left cheek, the coppery taste of blood where my teeth had cut the inside of my mouth. For a moment, the world seemed to stop completely. I couldn't hear anything except a high ringing in my ears and my own heartbeat. "You are suspended as CEO effective immediately," Thomas said, his voice shaking with rage or adrenaline, or perhaps some toxic combination of both. "You will not return to this office until you apologize to your sister for your jealousy, your sabotage, and your complete lack of family loyalty. You are a traitor to everything this family stands for." I straightened slowly, turning my head back to face him. I didn't raise my hand to my burning cheek. I didn't let the tears forming in my eyes fall. I simply looked at my father, really looked at him, and saw a weak man who'd spent years punishing the daughter who reminded him of his own inadequacies while elevating the one who made him feel powerful. And then, for just a fraction of a second, I smiled. It was barely there. Just the slightest upturn at the corner of my mouth, gone so quickly most people would have missed it. But I felt it, and I knew what it meant. This was it. The moment I'd been waiting for, the moment I'd been preparing for since I was 25 years old, and first realized my father would never see me as anything other than a problem to be managed. "Very well," I said. My voice came out perfectly calm, eerily controlled. I collected my laptop, disconnected it from the presentation system, and tucked it under my arm. I didn't look at Grace. I didn't look at anyone except Thomas. "I accept your decision." The composure in my voice seemed to unsettle the room more than if I'd screamed or cried or begged. I watched confusion flicker across my father's face quickly, followed by something that might have been doubt. He'd expected resistance. He'd expected drama. He'd expected me to fight for a position he'd never really given me in the first place. Instead, I walked toward the door with perfect posture, my heels clicking against the marble floor in a steady, unhurried rhythm. As I reached for the handle, I heard Margaret Chen say softly, "Thomas, what have you done?" But I didn't turn around. I didn't dignify the question with an answer. I simply walked out of the boardroom down the corridor lined with photographs of my mother's achievements that Thomas had gradually replaced with images of himself, and into the elevator that would take me to my office for the very last time. As the elevator doors closed, I caught my reflection in the polished steel. My left cheek was already starting to redden where his hand had connected. My eyes were dry, and I was still smiling just a little. Because what none of them knew, not my father, not Grace, not anyone in that room, was that I'd spent the last 3 years building an exit strategy. Every late night I'd spent fixing Grace's mistakes had also been spent documenting them, creating backups, establishing relationships, and quietly constructing a life that didn't need Bowen Corp or the Bowen name. I'd been preparing for this exact moment for 3 years, and now finally, it was time to let them see what they'd actually lost. The elevator ride to the executive floor felt longer than usual, or perhaps time had simply changed texture in the aftermath of violence. My cheek still throbbed with a dull, persistent ache that I knew would blossom into a bruise by evening. I pressed my keycard against the reader outside my corner office and stepped inside, closing the door behind me with a quiet click that sounded remarkably like finality. The space had never truly felt like mine, despite 6 years of occupation. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the city skyline, offering a view my father had once told me I should be grateful for when he'd assigned me this office at 27. The desk was glass and chrome, modern and cold, chosen by a corporate designer rather than by me. The walls held framed certificates of achievement and industry awards, all earned, none celebrated. I walked to the supply closet and pulled out 3 banker's boxes, setting them on the desk with a soft thud. I started with the file cabinets, working methodically through 6 years of organized chaos. My hands moved automatically, muscle memory from countless late nights spent in this very spot, but my mind was cataloging everything with clinical precision. Each folder I touched carried a memory, a small wound in an anthology of paper cuts that had slowly bled me dry. The Hendrick Industries folder reminded me of the time Grace had accidentally copied their competitor on a confidential bid proposal. I'd discovered the error at 11 p.m. on a Friday, spent the entire weekend on the phone with Hendrick's CEO, a man who'd worked with my mother and still had a soft spot for the Bowen name, convincing him that it was a technical glitch rather than corporate espionage. By Monday morning, I'd not only salvaged the relationship, but had restructured our entire email security protocol to prevent future incidents. That Tuesday, my father had called me into his office to lecture me about making Grace feel bad by implementing new systems without consulting her first. I placed the folder in the box and reached for the next one. The Meridian contract files brought back the memory of Grace promising a 3-month delivery timeline to impress a client during a golf outing, despite our production capacity requiring at least 7 months. I'd spent 48 hours straight reorganizing our entire supply chain, calling in favors from vendors I'd carefully cultivated relationships with over years, and personally overseeing a manufacturing schedule that had our team working in rotating shifts. We'd delivered in 3 months and 2 weeks. Grace got a profile in a business magazine calling her the visionary behind Bowen Corp's aggressive growth strategy. I got an email from my father saying I needed to be more of a team player, because apparently I'd made some of Grace's original timeline promises look slightly optimistic in front of the client. Box 1 filled up quickly. I moved to box 2, pulling down the small personal items that had accumulated over the years. A coffee mug that said, "World's Best Boss," gifted ironically by my assistant who'd quit last year because she couldn't stomach watching me take blame for problems I didn't create. A framed photograph of my mother at her desk in this very office, back when it had been hers, back when Bowen Corp meant something beyond Thomas's ego and Grace's Instagram-ready career. I wrapped the frame carefully in tissue paper, wondering what my mother would think of what her company had become. My entire 33 years had been an exercise in conditional love. When I was 7 and won the school science fair, my father had smiled and said, "That's my girl," before immediately asking if I'd helped Grace with her project too. When I graduated summa cum laude from MIT at 22, he'd attended the ceremony but spent the reception talking about Grace's natural business instincts, despite her having dropped out of her MBA program after one semester. When I'd pulled Bowen Corp back from the brink of bankruptcy at 29 after a disastrous product launch Grace had championed, he'd thanked me privately and then publicly credited Grace's bold vision for the eventual turnaround. I was loved when I was useful. I was valued when I was invisible. I was family when I was serving their interests. But those days were over. I pulled up my laptop and opened the resignation letter I'd drafted 2 years ago and updated quarterly ever since, like a will for a life I was preparing to leave behind. The document was pristine in its simplicity, devoid of emotion or accusation. It stated my immediate resignation from all positions at Bowen Corp, effective upon delivery of the letter. It offered a 2-week transition period, if desired by the board. It thanked the company for the opportunity and wished everyone well in their future endeavors. It was professional, courteous, and utterly final. 3 paragraphs, 147 words. The death certificate of my father's control over my life. I printed it on company letterhead, signed it with the fountain pen my mother had given me when I'd joined the company, and placed it in the center of the now empty desk. The envelope was crisp white, addressed simply to Board of Directors, Bowen Corporation. I propped it against the base of the desk lamp where it couldn't possibly be missed. The third box held the last of my personal files' encrypted backup drives containing documentation I'd been compiling for 3 years. Every email where Grace had made a critical error, every late-night fix I'd implemented, every instance where Thomas had rewritten history to make Grace the hero and me the obstacle. 6 years of evidence meticulously organized, time-stamped, and verified. I'd created this archive not out of spite but out of self-preservation, knowing that someday I might need to prove my own worth to myself if no one else would acknowledge it. I sealed the boxes with packing tape, the sound sharp and satisfying in the quiet office. I took one last look around the space that had been both my kingdom and my prison. The late afternoon sun streamed through those floor-to-ceiling windows, casting long shadows across the empty desk. I'd given this company 6 years of 80-hour weeks, countless sacrifices, and my complete dedication. In return, I'd received a slap and a suspension. It was the best trade I'd ever made. I picked up 2 of the boxes, balancing them carefully, and walked out. I'd come back for the 3rd box tomorrow, but I already knew I'd never step foot in this office as an employee again. The door locked automatically behind me, and I didn't look back. The office that had felt like a cage for 6 years had just become my launching pad. And tomorrow morning, when Grace walked in expecting to gloat over my humiliation, she would discover exactly what she'd actually won. The next morning, Grace walked into the office expecting triumph and froze in absolute horror. I didn't witness Grace's arrival at my former office, but my assistant, technically former assistant Jennifer, texted me a photo at 8:47 the next morning. The image showed Grace standing in the doorway of the empty office, her mouth slightly open, one hand frozen in mid-reach as if she'd been about to touch something that was no longer there. Her expression was a portrait of confusion sliding rapidly toward something darker. Jennifer's message read simply, "She's been standing there for 3 minutes, not moving, just staring." I was 2 hours north by then, sitting in a cafe in Portsmouth with an excellent cappuccino and my laptop watching the sunrise over the harbor. I'd driven up the night before, checked into a small bed and breakfast that asked no questions, and slept better than I had in 6 years. The photo of Grace's frozen shock was the perfect accompaniment to my morning coffee. According to Jennifer, who continued sending updates like a war correspondent from the front lines, Grace had arrived at the office at 8:30, wearing a new designer suit and carrying herself with the swagger of someone who believed she'd finally won. She'd apparently told the receptionist that she was checking on some transitional matters in Natalie's office, her voice dripping with false concern that barely masked her satisfaction. She'd taken the elevator to the executive floor, her heels clicking with confident authority, and pushed open the door to my corner office, expecting to find me broken compliant and ready to grovel. Instead, she found a space so thoroughly stripped, it looked like I'd never existed at all. Jennifer reported that Grace walked slowly around the empty office, opening drawers that held nothing, running her fingers along the bare shelves where my files had been. The resignation letter sat in the center of the glass desk, pristine white against the chrome surface, impossible to miss. Grace picked it up with shaking hands and read it 3 times, according to Jennifer, who'd positioned herself near the doorway under the pretense of delivering mail. "This wasn't supposed to happen," Grace said aloud to the empty room, and Jennifer swore there was genuine panic in her voice. "She was supposed to apologize. She always apologizes eventually." But I hadn't apologized. I'd left. And that simple act had apparently short-circuited Grace's entire understanding of how our family dynamic worked. The panic spread like wildfire through the building within the hour. Jennifer's updates came rapid-fire. 9:15 Senior Mechanical Engineer Martin Rodriguez asking loudly in the hallway, "Who has access to Natalie's systems architecture documentation?" 9:32 Operations Director Patricia Kim standing in the empty office muttering, she was the only one who understood how all the vendor relationships connected. 9:47 A cluster of longtime employees gathering outside my former office, their faces reflecting the same dawning horror that I'd apparently broken some fundamental law of nature by actually leaving. "Without Natalie, we're completely lost," I heard one voice say on a video clip Jennifer sent me. "She was the one who made everything work." Grace just smiled for the cameras. I imagined Grace standing in that empty office, hearing those words drift up from the hallway, finally understanding that she'd never actually held any real power at all. She'd been performing leadership while I'd been executing it. She'd been taking credit while I'd been taking responsibility. And now that I was gone, the carefully maintained illusion of her competence had evaporated like morning mist under harsh sunlight. Jennifer's final update of the morning came at 10:15. "Your father just arrived, face like thunder. Grace is crying in the conference room." I could picture Thomas storming through the building, his ego bruised by what he'd surely interpret as my tantrum, fully expecting to find me packed and ready to slink back with my tail between my legs. He'd probably rehearsed a magnanimous speech about accepting my apology and giving me another chance that would somehow make him the hero of this story. Instead, he found an empty office and a resignation letter. According to my sources, I had more than just Jennifer. 6 years of treating people with basic human decency had earned me loyalties my father knew nothing about. Thomas initially dismissed the whole thing as theater. "She'll be back by Monday." He'd apparently told the attorney David Hutchins, who'd been called up to the executive floor to review the letter. "This is just Natalie being dramatic. She needs this job more than we need her." David, to his credit, had actually read the letter carefully. Then he'd pulled up Natalie's employment files, her contract, and the organizational charts that showed her signature authorities and relationship ownerships. I knew the exact moment when David's face went pale because Jennifer caught it on her phone and sent me the clip. The attorney had looked up from his tablet and said very quietly, "Thomas, we have a significant problem." Thomas had waved him off. "She's suspended, not fired. She'll calm down and come back." "No," David said, his voice taking on that particular tone lawyers use when delivering very bad news. "You don't understand. Natalie has signatory authority on 47 active contracts. She's the primary relationship manager for our 3 largest clients who specifically requested her involvement. She controls access to proprietary technical documentation that she personally developed. And many of these arrangements..." David paused, scrolling through something on his screen. Many of these were structured so that her authority is personal, not positional. She can transfer them, but we can't. I'd spent 3 years building those protections, careful and quiet and meticulous. Every contract renewal, every client meeting, every technical development had been structured to ensure that I, Natalie Bowen, the person not Natalie Bowen, the interim CEO, held the keys. It was perfectly legal, carefully documented, and completely devastating to anyone who thought I was replaceable. Thomas apparently sat down heavily in one of the conference room chairs. "What does that mean exactly?" "It means," David said, "that you didn't just suspend your CEO. You likely just triggered a cascade of contractual complications that could—" That's when David's phone rang. He glanced at the screen and Jennifer reported that his face somehow went even paler. He answered, listened for approximately 30 seconds, and then said something that made Thomas stand up so fast his chair fell backward. "The $50 million defense contract has been canceled. They'll only work with Natalie." I was refilling my cappuccino when Jennifer's text arrived with a screenshot of an email from Patriot Defense Systems. The subject line read, "Contract termination, effective immediately." I sat back down at my corner table in the Portsmouth Cafe, the morning sun warming my shoulders, and read the attachment with the same clinical detachment I'd once used to review Grace's disasters. The email was professional cold and utterly devastating. Patriot Defense Systems was withdrawing from all agreements with Bowen Corp., citing lack of confidence in current management's ability to deliver on contractual obligations. The termination was effective immediately with penalty clauses waived as a professional courtesy to the years of excellent service provided by Ms. Natalie Bowen personally. I noticed they'd copied the email to Thomas, Grace, David Hutchins, and the entire board of directors. They wanted everyone to know exactly why they were leaving. Jennifer followed up with a voice memo recorded from outside the conference room where my father had apparently retreated with David and Grace. I could hear Thomas's voice tight with barely controlled panic, demanding to know how this had happened. Then a different voice came on the line. The call had been transferred to speaker, and I recognized Colonel Bradley Morrison, Patriot's Chief Procurement Officer, a man I'd worked with personally on 4 separate projects over the past 3 years. "Mr. Bowen," Colonel Morrison said, his military precision evident even through Jennifer's recording, "I want to be clear about why we're taking this action. We received credible information yesterday afternoon that Ms. Grace Bowen has a documented history of reckless decision-making that has compromised multiple projects. The source provided specific examples, dates, and outcomes. We did our own verification overnight and found the information to be accurate." I heard Grace's voice in the background, high and defensive. "That's a lie. Someone is sabotaging me." "The information came from internal Bowen Corp documentation," Morrison continued, ignoring the outburst. "More importantly, our analysis revealed that every successful project we've completed with your company had one common denominator: Natalie Bowen's direct involvement. She was the reason we maintained confidence in Bowen Corp's capabilities, despite management inconsistencies." Thomas's voice cut in, trying to sound authoritative, but coming across as desperate. "Colonel Morrison, I assure you that Grace's momentary errors have been addressed, and we have full capability to—" "With respect, Mr. Bowen, they weren't momentary errors. Our review showed a 3-year pattern of overpromising and requiring extensive correction. The only reason those corrections succeeded was because of Natalie Bowen's intervention." Morrison paused, and I could almost see him checking his notes. "Unless Ms. Natalie Bowen provides personal written guarantee of project oversight, we cannot in good conscience move forward with a $50 million contract. That is our final position." The line went dead. Jennifer's recording captured what sounded like something heavy being thrown against a wall, followed by Grace sobbing and Thomas saying words I couldn't quite make out, but whose tone suggested he was starting to comprehend the magnitude of what he'd done. By noon, according to my network of informants still inside Bowen Corp., David Hutchins had compiled what he grimly called the damage assessment. He'd presented it to an emergency board meeting that included Thomas Grace, Margaret Chen, and 3 other senior directors. The document Jennifer managed to photograph and send me was 47 pages of meticulously organized evidence that I'd never actually created. David had pulled it from existing company files, email archives, and project records that I'd never bothered to hide because I'd never imagined anyone would actually look. The timeline was devastating in its clarity. 12 major projects over 3 years. In each case, Grace had made critical errors: the Northrop contract, where she'd promised delivery in 6 months for a system requiring 14, the Lockheed bid, where she'd accidentally specified components that didn't exist, the Boeing partnership, where she'd agreed to penalty clauses that would have bankrupted us if we'd missed a single milestone. And in every single case, there was a corresponding record of Natalie Bowen working 72-hour stretches, calling in favors, restructuring timelines, and somehow pulling success from the jaws of disaster. The email records were even more damning. Grace's name appeared on press releases, client announcements, and industry awards. My name appeared on internal crisis management threads, late-night technical consultations, and vendor emergency negotiations. She'd gotten the credit. I'd done the work. And everyone had been happy to maintain that fiction as long as it kept the machine running. Margaret Chen apparently stood up during the meeting and said something that Jennifer heard through the conference room door. Grace isn't incompetent because she's stupid. She's incompetent because someone has been setting her up to fail, and we were all too comfortable to notice. That's when David dropped the detail that made my coffee suddenly taste bitter. He'd cross-referenced the dates of Grace's worst decisions with her calendar and found a pattern that Jennifer said made Thomas go very, very quiet. Before each major mistake, Grace had a meeting or phone call with someone listed only as VH, business mentor. The initials appeared 17 times over 3 years, and each appearance preceded a decision that required my intervention to fix. "Who is VH?" Margaret asked according to Jennifer's account. Grace, still crying, had whispered, "Victor Hartwell. He's a family friend who's been advising me on strategy. He said he wanted to help me prove myself." The room apparently went silent. David pulled up information on Victor Hartwell, and Jennifer reported that Thomas's face had turned an alarming shade of gray when he saw the name. Victor Hartwell ran Westlake Industries, a corporate consulting firm known for hostile acquisitions. More than that, and this is what made Thomas stand up and walk to the window. Victor Hartwell had been my mother's first husband, the man she'd divorced 28 years ago and spent the rest of her life trying to forget. Someone had been deliberately sabotaging Bowen Corp from the inside, using Grace's ambition and naivety as the weapon. And the only person who'd been catching and neutralizing those attacks was now sitting 2 states away, drinking excellent coffee and watching the entire structure collapse in real time. Jennifer's final message of the afternoon was brief. "Your father asked me to contact you. He wants to know what it will take for you to come back. I told him I don't have your new number. What should I say?" I didn't respond, because the $50 million loss was just the beginning, and I had no intention of stopping the bleeding. Not yet. But the $50 million loss was just the beginning, because Natalie had left behind a document that would tear the company apart from within. I'd arranged for the courier service 3 weeks earlier, back when I was still refining the final sections of what I privately called The Reckoning. The dossier had been completed for 2 years, updated quarterly like a living document, waiting for the inevitable moment when my father's favoritism would cross from merely painful into professionally untenable. The slap had simply provided the perfect timing. The packages went out at 6 p.m. on Thursday evening, delivered to home addresses I'd carefully verified through public records and discreet inquiries. Not to the office where Thomas could intercept them, not to corporate emails he could block, but to the personal residences of all 11 board members, timed to arrive during their Friday morning coffee routines when they'd be most receptive to reading something substantial. Each envelope contained an identical 247-page document professionally bound with a simple cover page that read, "Bowen Corporation, a Forensic Analysis of Management Efficacy, 2018-2024, compiled by Natalie Bowen. I'd labored over that dossier with the same meticulous attention I'd given to every project I'd ever saved. The opening section contained a comprehensive timeline of 12 major projects displayed in a side-by-side format that would make even the most casual reader understand the discrepancy. On the left, Grace's public claims, her press interviews, her LinkedIn posts celebrating her visionary leadership. On the right, the actual project records showing missed deadlines, technical impossibilities, and contractual violations that should have sunk each initiative. And in the center column, highlighted in pale blue, my work timestamped and verified, showing the midnight interventions and weekend marathons that had transformed certain disasters into celebrated successes. The Northrop Grumman section alone ran 17 pages. I'd included the original contract Grace had negotiated, promising a 6-month delivery timeline, her enthusiastic email to the client calling it ambitious but achievable, and the engineering assessment I'd commissioned that proved the actual requirement was 14 months minimum. Then came my restructuring plan, the vendor negotiations I'd personally conducted at 2 a.m. because our suppliers were based in Taiwan, and the final delivery report showing we'd somehow met an adjusted 9-month timeline that I'd negotiated directly with Northrop's project manager during a series of calls Grace never knew about. The kicker was the industry magazine article praising Grace's bold vision and flawless execution. I'd included financial impact analyses for each project calculated by an independent consultant I'd hired using my own money. The numbers were staggering. Grace's initial decisions on these 12 projects would have cost Bowen Corp approximately $43 million in penalties, lost contracts, and damaged relationships. My corrections had not only prevented those losses, but had generated an additional $18 million in revenue through the relationship capital I'd built with clients who appreciated competence over charisma. The section I knew would hurt most was titled Cleanup Logs and Subsequent Management Response. Here I'd documented 53 instances over 6 years where I'd worked extreme hours to fix Grace's mistakes, accompanied by the emails or meeting notes from the following morning, where Thomas had somehow found fault with my approach. There was the time I'd spent 72 hours straight reworking a proposal after Grace had accidentally sent our pricing strategy to a competitor, only to have my father scold me in the next management meeting for making Grace feel micromanaged by implementing a new proposal review system. There was the weekend I'd personally driven to 3 different supplier facilities to salvage relationships after Grace had insulted their representatives at a trade show dinner, followed by Thomas's lecture about my lack of team spirit for not attending that dinner in the first place. Each entry was backed by email screenshots, calendar invitations, security logs showing my building access at odd hours, and in some cases, testimonials from employees who'd worked those emergency shifts with me. No accusations, no emotional language, just timestamps and facts arranged in a pattern too consistent to dismiss as coincidence. The external influence timeline occupied pages 187 through 216 and represented some of my finest investigative work. I'd cross-referenced Grace's calendar entries with project outcomes, identified the pattern of contact with VH, business mentor, and mapped how each consultation preceded a decision that benefited neither Grace nor Bowen Corp. I stopped short of accusing Victor Hartwell directly. I didn't have proof of his intentions yet, only the correlation, but I included enough data that any competent board member would recognize corporate sabotage when they saw it. I'd even included a brief biography of Victor, mentioning casually that he was formerly married to Elizabeth Bowen Company co-founder, divorced 1996. The metadata analysis came last, a technical appendix that proved these documents weren't compiled in angry retaliation after the slap. File creation dates stretched back 6 years. Modification timestamps showed quarterly updates, and backup logs demonstrated systematic preservation of evidence over time. I'd built this archive the same way I'd built everything else at Bowen Corp, carefully, methodically, and with an eye toward the future most people refused to see coming. My final note, printed on page 247, read, This documentation exists not for revenge, but to ensure Bowen Corp understands the actual risks it faces. The company I've protected for 6 years is now vulnerable to threats both external and internal. I hope the board will choose to address these vulnerabilities wisely, with or without my involvement. The decision, as always, is yours to make. By Saturday morning, my phone had 17 missed calls from board members whose numbers I recognized and 4 from numbers I didn't. Margaret Chen had left a voicemail that Jennifer later told me had made her cry, "Natalie, I worked with your mother for 15 years and I failed her daughter for 6. I have no right to ask this, but please call me back. We need to fix this. We need to fix what we've done to you." Richard Sorensen, the CFO who'd never once defended me in a board meeting, sent an email with the subject line, "I'm sorry," and a body that simply said, "I was a coward. You deserved better. The company deserves better. Tell us what you need." Even Howard Phillips, the 68-year-old director who'd served with my grandfather and whom I'd always considered Thomas's closest ally, left a message that Jennifer said she'd never forget. "I read every page twice. We've been complicit in abusing this woman for 6 years and I'm ashamed. If Natalie Bowen never speaks to us again, we'll have earned that silence." But I didn't call them back. Not yet. Because while Bowen Corp descended into panic and soul-searching, I was 2 states away in Portsmouth, sipping excellent coffee and living a life they'd never known I'd built. The bed and breakfast in Portsmouth had excellent Wi-Fi, which was all I really needed. I'd set up my temporary office in the sunroom overlooking the harbor where fishing boats bobbed gently in the morning light and seagulls performed their endless aerial ballet. My laptop displayed the quarterly report I'd been waiting for. NatTech Women's Innovation Fund had closed Q2 with $4.3 million in assets under management, up 17% from the previous quarter. 47 women, most of them over 45, most of them told by venture capitalists that they were too old or too female or too niche, had built successful businesses with the seed funding I'd provided over the past 8 years. I'd started the fund with $200,000 earned from licensing my first software patent, a predictive maintenance algorithm I'd developed during my 2nd year at Bowen Corp, working in my apartment on weekends, because the company's equipment was too outdated for the kind of testing I needed. The patent was mine, not Bowen Corp's, because I'd been meticulous about using my own resources and my own time. Thomas had never known about it because he'd never asked what I did with my evenings. He'd assumed I went home and ate takeout alone, probably crying about Grace's latest triumph. Instead, I'd been building an empire he couldn't touch. The fund's portfolio read like a catalog of second chances. Patricia Chen, age 54, had pitched me an assistive technology company after being laid off from a Silicon Valley firm that told her she didn't fit the culture anymore. Her company now held 12 patents and had just secured a contract with a major hospital network. Linda Morrison, 52, had developed a cybersecurity platform specifically for small municipalities after watching her hometown get ransomware attacks because they couldn't afford enterprise solutions. She'd been rejected by 18 traditional VCs before I'd given her $150,000 in seed funding. Her company now protected 127 towns across New England and generated $2.1 million in annual revenue. These women didn't just represent good investments, though the returns had been solid. They represented a network of genuine power built on mutual respect and shared experience, rather than family obligation or corporate hierarchy. When I'd sent a brief email to the fund's advisory board explaining that I'd left Bowen Corp and might be less available for the next few weeks, I'd received 23 responses within an hour. Patricia wrote, "You gave me a second chance at 54 when everyone else saw me as obsolete. Whatever you need, I'm here." Linda offered to connect me with her attorney if I needed legal support. 3 other founders offered guest rooms if I needed places to stay. This was family, the chosen kind that actually mattered. The fund was just one part of what I'd built in the shadows of my family's contempt. My investment portfolio included a carefully selected collection of real estate acquired during market downturns, a duplex in Portland that generated rental income, a small commercial property in Boston leased to a medical practice, and a vacation cottage in Vermont that I'd bought, foreclosed, and renovated myself over 2 years of long weekends. I'd served as a silent partner in 3 tech startups, providing not just capital but technical consulting that the founders actually valued. My second and third patents, both related to integrated systems architecture that had applications far beyond Bowen Corp's defense contracting niche, generated modest but steady licensing revenue. When I tallied everything, the fund, the real estate, the startup equity, the patent royalties, my investment accounts, my personal net worth sat at approximately $3.8 million. Not Bezos money, not even enough to make the Forbes list, but more than sufficient to live comfortably for the rest of my life, without ever setting foot in Bowen Corp again. I'd achieved this through a discipline that my family had mistaken for joylessness, living in a modest 1-bedroom apartment in a neighborhood Grace would have called depressing, while she'd leveraged the company expense account for a penthouse downtown. Investing 40% of my salary while Thomas assumed I was too incompetent to manage money, and probably spent it all on cats and self-help books. Building relationships with people who valued my intellect and integrity rather than my last name or my ability to make Grace look good. The irony was almost funny. My family's greatest strategic error had been assuming I needed them. They'd structured their entire emotional leverage around the belief that without Bowen Corp, without the family name, without Thomas's grudging approval, I'd be nothing. They'd never bothered to notice that I'd been systematically building a life that didn't require any of them a safety net woven from competence and careful planning, rather than inheritance and nepotism. My phone continued buzzing with messages from Bowen Corp. Margaret Chen had called 6 times. Richard Sorensen had sent increasingly desperate emails. Even Grace had left a voicemail, though I'd deleted it without listening because I wasn't ready to hear whatever combination of tears and accusations she'd prepared. Each notification was a small validation proof that I'd been right about who actually needed whom in this relationship. The messages from my real network told a different story. Patricia sent a photo of her team celebrating their hospital contract with a note. "Because of you, 12 people have jobs they love, and thousands of patients will get better care. That's legacy." Linda shared news that another municipality had just signed on, bringing her total protected population over 200,000. A founder I'd backed 2 years ago announced she'd just been acquired by a major firm, which would generate a 340% return on my initial investment, and more importantly, meant her technology would reach a much wider market. This was what success actually looked like, when it wasn't measured by my father's approval or Grace's reflected glory. This was the life I'd built, while they'd been too busy performing family dysfunction to notice I'd been planning my exit for years. The sun was setting over Portsmouth Harbor, painting the water in shades of copper and gold, when my phone lit up with a text from Jennifer. "Your father just left the office. He asked me for your location. I told him I don't know, but Natalie, he looked broken. Really broken. Be careful." I was drafting a response when headlights swept across the sunroom windows. A car pulled into the bed and breakfast's small driveway, and through the growing darkness, I watched my father step out, moving like a man who'd aged 20 years in 3 days. I watched through the window as my father sat in his car for nearly 5 minutes before finally opening the door. Even from a distance, I could see the unfamiliar slope of his shoulders, the way he moved like someone who'd forgotten how his own body worked. Thomas Bowen had always carried himself with the rigid posture of a man who believed authority was something you wore like expensive cologne. The person climbing my porch steps looked diminished, almost fragile. When he knocked, I waited a full 30 seconds before answering. Let him stand there. Let him wonder if I was even going to open the door. When I finally did, his appearance shocked me more than I wanted to admit. His silver hair, usually immaculate, stuck up at odd angles like he'd been running his hands through it compulsively. His shirt was wrinkled tie loosened, and there were shadows under his eyes that spoke of sleepless nights. This was the first time my father had visited any home of mine since I was 17 and still living under his roof. "Natalie." His voice came out rough. He cleared his throat and tried again. "We need to talk about your responsibilities to the family." The word responsibilities cracked in the middle, betraying the authority he was trying to project. I stepped aside to let him in, not out of warmth, but because I wanted this conversation to happen on my terms in my space. He walked into the sunroom and looked around with barely concealed confusion, as if he couldn't reconcile this comfortable, carefully chosen environment with his image of me living some sad, diminished existence without the Bowen name propping me up. 3 more major clients have suspended their contracts, he said, still standing because I hadn't invited him to sit. Lockheed, Northrop, and BE Systems. They all said the same thing: they don't have confidence in current management. The board is calling emergency meetings every 6 hours. Margaret Chen is threatening to resign if we don't address the leadership crisis immediately. And Grace... He paused, something painful crossing his face. Grace has locked herself in her apartment and won't answer anyone's calls. David thinks she might be having some kind of breakdown. He turned to face me fully, and I saw him struggling to find the script he'd rehearsed the speech where he'd somehow make my return sound like noble duty rather than desperate need. The family legacy that your mother and I built is collapsing. You have a responsibility to know. I said it quietly, but the words stopped him mid-sentence. I fulfilled my responsibilities for 6 years while you told me I was never good enough. I'm not returning to be Grace's safety net or your scapegoat. Natalie, please. I know things have been difficult, but your mother would be disappointed in you for abandoning the family like this. The emotional manipulation was so predictable it was almost boring. I walked to my bag and pulled out the leather journal I'd been carrying with me since the slap, the one I'd found in my mother's belongings 5 years ago and had been reading and rereading ever since. My father's eyes widened when he recognized it. Would she? I opened to a page I'd marked with a yellow tab. March 14th, 2019. Thomas is getting weaker. He can't make a decision without checking with that consultant friend of his first. I'm worried he's going to sacrifice Natalie to protect his own ego. She's so much stronger than he is, and he resents her for it. I flipped to another marked page. June 3rd, 2020. Watched Thomas scold Natalie today for fixing another of Grace's mistakes. He's so afraid of his own inadequacy that he punishes competence and rewards incompetence. I don't know how to protect her from him anymore. My father had gone very pale. Where did you get that? Mom left it for me. I've had it for 5 years. I closed the journal and held it against my chest like a shield. I've known exactly what you are for a long time, Dad. And I still tried to help. I still stayed. I still worked 80-hour weeks to keep your company alive while you blamed me for every problem Grace created. The fact that you think Mom would be disappointed in me for finally leaving is proof you never understood her at all. He sat down heavily in one of the chairs without asking permission, and for a moment I thought he might cry. But Thomas Bowen had spent too many years building walls around his emotions to let them break that easily. Instead, he stared at his hands and said something I didn't expect. There's someone... He started again. A business consultant I've been taking advice from for years. Victor Hartwell. He presented himself as an old family friend, someone who knew your mother back in the early days. He's always known exactly what to say about Grace about you about the company. Thomas looked up at me and I saw genuine confusion in his eyes. But lately I'm wondering if he wanted this to happen, if he wanted us to fall apart. The name hit me like ice water. Victor Hartwell. I'd seen that name in my mother's journal, always written with a particular intensity that suggested pain barely contained. Her first husband, the man she'd divorced and spent the rest of her life trying to forget. And he'd been advising my father for years. What kind of advice did he give you? I kept my voice level, but my heart was racing. He'd call every few months, always with insights about the business. He encouraged me to give Grace more authority, said she had natural leadership instincts that just needed room to grow. He suggested that you were too controlling, too risk-averse, that you were holding Grace back from her potential. Thomas rubbed his face. Every time I had doubts about a decision, he'd somehow call right when I needed guidance. It felt like providence. Now it feels like... Manipulation, I finished. Systematic, deliberate manipulation. Thomas looked at me with something approaching horror. You think he's been sabotaging us? Why would he? Because Mom left him. The words came out harder than I intended. She left him, built a life without him, and he's the kind of man who never forgives that. My father stood abruptly, agitation replacing his earlier exhaustion. If that's true, if he's been deliberately destroying the company, then we need to fight back. We need you back, Natalie. We need to... I let the question hang in the air. There is no we, Dad. You slapped me in front of the board and suspended me for telling the truth. You spent 6 years choosing grace over me, blame over fairness, ego over reality. The fact that you might have been manipulated doesn't erase what you did. It just makes you a victim too, and I'm done saving victims who won't save themselves. He opened his mouth to argue, then closed it again. For the first time in my life, I watched my father truly lost for words. He walked to the door, paused with his hand on the knob, and said without turning around, "I'm sorry. I know it's too late, and I know it's not enough, but I'm sorry." After he left, I stood at the window watching his taillights disappear down the coastal road. The night had settled in completely, turning the harbor into a black mirror dotted with the lights of distant boats. I was about to close the curtains when I noticed something that made my breath catch. A black sedan parked down the street, engine off, headlights dark. The same make and model I'd seen outside Bowen Corp's building 3 times in the 2 weeks before the slap. The same car I'd dismissed as coincidence because I'd been too focused on surviving each day to see the larger pattern forming around me. Someone was watching. Someone had been watching for a while. And now I knew exactly who it was. I waited until the sedan had been stationary for 15 minutes before stepping outside with my phone, pretending to take photos of the harbor under moonlight while actually zooming in on the license plate. The angle was awkward, but I managed 3 clear shots before retreating back inside. My hands were shaking slightly as I texted the images to Marcus Chen, a private investigator I'd used twice before for background checks on potential fund investments. His specialty was corporate intelligence, and he owed me a favor after I'd funded his sister's medical device startup. Marcus responded within minutes. "On it. Should have preliminary info in an hour." While I waited, I opened my laptop and began pulling threads I should have noticed years ago. Grace's emails mentioning her mentor went back 38 months, always vague about his identity, but specific about his advice. V says I should push for faster timelines to show confidence. V thinks you're being too cautious with the Lockheed bid. V suggested I take the lead on the defense contract to prove my capabilities. Every piece of advice I now realized had been precisely calibrated to create disaster. I cross-referenced Thomas's calendar against major strategic shifts at Bowen Corp. In April 2021, he'd suddenly decided to restructure our R&D department against the recommendations of our entire technical team. The restructuring had cost us 3 senior engineers and delayed 2 critical projects. His calendar showed a call with V. Hartwell, business consulting, 2 days before announcing the change. In September 2022, he'd abruptly pulled funding from a promising technology platform I'd been developing, calling it too risky, despite positive third-party assessments. Another call with Victor 3 days prior. The pattern was suffocating in its consistency. Victor would call, Thomas would make a destabilizing decision. I would scramble to minimize the damage, and Grace would somehow end up looking like the forward-thinking one while I was painted as resistant to change. I pulled my mother's journals from my bag and started reading them systematically, something I'd never done before because the pain had always felt too raw. But tonight, I needed answers more than I needed to protect myself from old wounds. The first mention of Victor appeared in an entry from 1994, 2 years before my birth. Victor Hartwell is brilliant, manipulative, and dangerous. Marrying him was the worst mistake of my life. He doesn't see people as individuals. He sees us as variables in equations he's constantly solving. When I told him I wanted a divorce, he said, "You'll regret leaving me. I'll make sure you spend the rest of your life regretting it." I believe him. Entry after entry documented a woman trying to escape a man who viewed her departure as a theft of property. Victor called the office again today. Didn't threaten, didn't yell, just asked how I was doing in that voice that suggests he knows everything about my life. I'm going to have to get a restraining order. Another from 1998. Found out Victor has been calling my clients asking friendly questions about whether I'm stable enough to handle their accounts. He's trying to destroy my reputation because he can't control me anymore. The entries stopped for several years after she married Thomas, and I'd initially assumed that meant Victor had finally moved on. But reading more carefully, I saw references scattered throughout, always oblique, always tinged with fear. Saw Victor at a conference today. He smiled at me like we were old friends and asked about the family. I felt sick for hours afterward. Thomas mentioned a helpful consultant gave him advice about the company. When I asked who, he said just a guy named Victor. My blood ran cold. My phone buzzed. Marcus had sent a preliminary report that made my stomach drop. The sedan was registered to a shell company called Meridian Holdings LLC, which was owned by another shell company which ultimately traced back to Westlake Industries. Corporate registration documents showed Victor Hartwell as founder and CEO. Westlake specialized in corporate consulting and strategic acquisitions, which Marcus's notes explained was code for "we break companies from the inside and buy the pieces cheap." I kept reading. Westlake had been involved in 14 corporate takeovers in the past 20 years, all following the same pattern: position someone inside the target company as a helpful advisor, provide guidance that slowly destabilized operations, wait for the stock price to crater, then acquire the company at a fraction of its actual value. The average timeline from first contact to acquisition was 4 to 6 years. Victor had been advising Thomas for at least 5 years by my father's own admission. But the detail that made my hands go numb was buried in the corporate filings Marcus had accessed. Westlake Industries had filed preliminary monitoring reports on Bowen Corp with the SEC dating back 30 years, right around the time my mother had married Thomas. Not acquisition attempts, just monitoring reports, the kind filed when a company or individual is tracking another entity for potential future action. Victor had been watching my mother's new life for 3 decades waiting. And 5 years ago, my mother had died in what was ruled an accidental car crash. Single-vehicle accident on a rainy night. Medical examiner concluded she'd swerved to avoid an animal and hit a tree. No witnesses, no reason to suspect foul play. But sitting in my rented sunroom in Maine reading about a man who'd spent 30 years stalking my mother's every move, the word accidental felt increasingly fragile. I flipped to the final entries in her journal dated just weeks before her death. Victor's calls are becoming more frequent. He's asking about the girls, now using their names like he knows them. He asked how Natalie's career is developing and whether Grace is living up to her potential. He shouldn't know these things. I need to document everything in case something happens to me. 2 days before she died, my mother had written her last entry. The handwriting was shakier than usual, pressed hard into the paper like she'd been gripping the pen too tightly. Victor called again. He knows about the girls, their schedules, their roles at the company, even things I haven't told anyone outside the family. He said, "Your daughters are impressive, Elizabeth. It would be tragic if anything disrupted their promising futures." It wasn't a compliment. It was a threat. I have to protect them, but I'm running out of time. Tomorrow I'm going to the police with everything I have. If something happens to me, I need Natalie to know Victor Hartwell will not stop until he's destroyed everything I built and everyone I love. He has to be stopped. The next entry was blank. The following page was blank. The rest of the journal contained only empty lines, a life cut short before the warning could be completed. My mother had died on her way to the police station. At least that's what the accident report suggested based on her route. And now her warning sat in my hands 5 years too late, but suddenly horrifyingly relevant. Victor hadn't just been sabotaging Bowen Corp. He'd been positioning pieces on a chessboard for decades, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. My mother's death had removed his primary obstacle. And now he'd successfully turned Thomas against me, weaponized Grace's insecurities, and isolated me from the only company I'd ever known. The black sedan was still parked down the street, still watching, still waiting. I spent the rest of the night sitting in the dark, watching the black sedan through a crack in the curtains. It didn't move. Whoever was inside didn't even pretend to leave. Around 3 a.m., I finally accepted that sleep wasn't coming and climbed the narrow stairs to the cottage's attic, a cramped space I'd been using for storage since purchasing the property 2 years ago. My mother's belongings occupied the far corner, sealed in plastic bins I'd labeled but never fully unpacked. The grief had been too fresh when she died, and then I'd been too busy keeping Bowen Corp alive to properly mourn. I tore through the bins with an urgency that bordered on violence, pulling out photo albums and old business files until my hands closed around a hand-carved wooden box I'd forgotten existed. The wood was dark walnut inlaid with an intricate pattern of vines and flowers and secured with a brass lock that had no visible keyhole. I'd seen this box once before in my mother's study when I was 16. When I'd asked about it, she'd smiled mysteriously and said, "Someday this will be yours, but not yet. You'll know when you're ready." I'd assumed it contained family heirlooms or sentimental jewelry, something passed down through generations. The key had arrived on my 33rd birthday 6 months ago, delivered by a lawyer I'd never met who explained it had been held in trust with instructions to release it when I reached that specific age. The key was unusual, flat, and geometric, designed for a puzzle lock rather than a traditional mechanism. At the time, I'd been so deep in crisis management at Bowen Corp that I'd tucked it in my jewelry box and forgotten about it. Now I retrieved the key from my bag downstairs and fitted it into what I'd thought was purely decorative metalwork on the box's front panel. The mechanism clicked and released with satisfying precision, and the lid opened to reveal contents that made my breath catch. 3 leather-bound journals, their spines labeled with date ranges spanning 25 years. A USB drive in a protective case labeled in my mother's handwriting, "For Natalie when you're ready." And a photograph slightly faded showing my mother standing outside what looked like a courthouse, her face pale and drawn, confronting a man whose back was to the camera, but whose aggressive posture spoke volumes. I started with the journals, reading by the light of my phone since I didn't want to turn on lamps that might signal to my watcher that I was awake. These weren't the journals I'd already read, those had been her professional diaries kept sporadically. These were different, more personal, more frightened. The first entry was dated 1992, 2 years before she divorced Victor. "He monitors everything I do, who I talk to, where I go, how long I take at the grocery store. Today he asked why I'd spent 43 minutes at the bookstore instead of my usual 30. He'd timed me. I'm starting to understand that this isn't love, it's ownership, and I don't know how to escape something that's been systematically removing every exit." The journals chronicled a nightmare of psychological control that made my skin crawl. Victor had isolated her from friends, undermined her confidence in her own perceptions, and created a web of dependence so thorough that leaving seemed impossible. But she'd done it anyway, carefully documenting every incident of controlling behavior, every threat disguised as concern, building a case until she had enough evidence to file for divorce and win. The entries after her divorce painted an even more disturbing picture. Victor doesn't forgive, he doesn't forget, and he never stops playing the long game, she'd written in 1997. "He's moved on to another relationship, but I see him at industry events, always watching, always smiling, that smile that means he's calculating something. I know this isn't over." The final journal covered the months before her death, and reading it felt like watching a horror movie where you desperately wanted to warn the protagonist but could only witness their doom unfold. She documented Victor's escalating stalking, appearing at her office building, sending flowers with notes that referenced private conversations only a stalker would know, engineering chance encounters at restaurants and conferences. Most chilling was her description of how he'd begun cultivating Thomas, positioning himself as a helpful mentor while slowly poisoning my father's confidence and judgment. "Victor knows my greatest fear is him hurting my daughters," she'd written 6 weeks before she died. "He's positioning himself to do exactly that, but not with violence, with psychological warfare. He'll turn them against each other, because he knows that will destroy me more than anything else." I have to stop him before he can execute whatever he's planning. The last entry detailed her appointment with a lawyer to file for a permanent restraining order, and her plans to go to the police with evidence of stalking. She'd been driving home from that lawyer's office when she'd crashed. The timing felt less coincidental with each page I read. My hands were shaking as I opened the USB drive on my laptop. Instead of old evidence that would be legally useless after so many years, I found a meticulously organized digital archive that took my breath away. My mother had hired a private investigator, not just any PI, but someone who'd apparently spent 2 years building a comprehensive map of Victor's operations. The files were organized into folders with clinical precision. Shell company structures contained diagrams showing how Victor funneled money through layers of corporate entities. Previous victims listed 6 companies Victor had destroyed using the same internal destabilization tactics he was now using on Bowen Corp, complete with timelines and patterns. Westlake employees' potential witnesses included names, backgrounds, and notes about people who'd expressed reservations about Victor's methods. My mother had been building a prosecutable case, not just a restraining order. The final file was labeled for Natalie MP4. I clicked it with trembling hands and watched my mother's face appear on screen, recorded in what looked like her home office. She looked tired but determined, and I could see the strain of fear around her eyes. "Natalie," she began, her voice steady despite the circumstances. "If you're watching this, it means I couldn't finish what I started. But you can. Everything you need is here. The evidence, the patterns, the witnesses. Victor Hartwell is a predator who destroys people for sport, and he's been circling our family for years. I tried to stop him, but I'm running out of time. You're stronger than I ever was, smarter than he expects, and you have something I never had. You understand systems and how to dismantle them. End what he began, sweetheart. Protect your sister, save the company if you can, but most importantly, stop him from hurting anyone else. I believe in you more than I've ever believed in anything." The video ended with my mother reaching toward the camera, and then the screen went black. I sat in the dim attic, tears streaming down my face, holding evidence that my mother had died trying to protect me from a threat I'd been too naive to see coming. My phone buzzed in the silence, making me jump. A text from an unknown number appeared on the screen. "Your mother couldn't stop me. What makes you think you can—" I stared at the threatening text for a full minute before the second message arrived. This one was an image, a high-resolution photograph of me walking out of Bowen Corp's front entrance on the day I'd resigned, carrying 2 boxes, my face visible in perfect detail. The timestamp showed it had been taken from across the street, probably with a telephoto lens. Someone had been watching me that closely, documenting my departure like evidence in a file they were building. The third message arrived before I could process the second. An email from an encrypted address with no subject line, just a PDF attachment labeled Bowen Paternity Analysis 2004 PDF. My finger hovered over the attachment for several seconds, some instinct warning me that opening it would cross a threshold I couldn't return from. But I'd already crossed so many thresholds in the past week that one more seemed inevitable. The document was a DNA paternity test, professionally formatted and bearing the letterhead of a genetics laboratory in Boston. The test date was April 2004, 20 years ago, which would have been shortly after Grace was born. The results were clinical and devastating: probability of paternity between Thomas Bowen and Grace Bowen 0%. Probability of paternity between Victor Hartwell and Grace Bowen 99.97%. I read it 3 times each pass, making my hands shake harder. Grace wasn't Thomas's daughter. Grace was Victor's daughter, which meant my mother had been pregnant with Victor's child when she'd escaped him, or had somehow been trapped into one final encounter that had resulted in Grace's conception. Either scenario was a horror I didn't want to imagine in detail. A follow-up email arrived seconds later, this one containing a single line: "The child always pays for the parent's sins. Your mother tried to keep secrets. I'm better at revealing them." I immediately forwarded everything to Marcus with an urgent flag asking him to trace the email's origin and verify the authenticity of the DNA test. While I waited, my mind was racing through implications that made me feel sick. Every mentoring session Grace had described with her mysterious advisor suddenly took on a nightmarish dimension. Victor had been cultivating a relationship with his own biological daughter, grooming her under the pretense of professional guidance, while actually molding her into a weapon against the family that had stolen her from him. Grace's desperate need for approval, her recklessness, her jealousy of me. I'd always attributed those traits to birth order dynamics and Thomas's favoritism. But what if they'd been deliberately cultivated? What if Victor had been feeding Grace's insecurities the same way a gardener feeds a plant, knowing exactly which psychological nutrients would make her grow in the direction he wanted? Marcus responded within 20 minutes. The email had originated from Westlake Industries' corporate office, routed through multiple VPN layers, but ultimately traceable to Victor's personal network. The DNA test appeared authentic based on the laboratory's legitimate credentials, though Marcus noted it would have been conducted without Thomas's knowledge or consent, which raised questions about how Victor had obtained the samples. I pulled up my mother's journals again, searching for any reference to Grace's conception or birth. Most of the entries from that period were missing pages carefully removed, leaving only ragged edges in the binding. My mother had deliberately erased that part of her story, probably to protect Grace from ever knowing the circumstances of her birth. But one entry remained dated 2 weeks after Grace was born. She's perfect and innocent, and she deserves a father who will love her unconditionally. Thomas has agreed to raise her as his own, and we will never speak of her biological origin again. Some secrets are kinder than truth. The pieces of my childhood suddenly rearranged themselves into a pattern that was heartbreaking rather than merely unfair. Thomas hadn't favored Grace out of malice toward me. He'd been overcompensating, trying desperately to prove he could love a child born from his wife's trauma with another man. Every extravagant gift, every defense of her mistakes, every time he'd chosen her over me had been Thomas trying to convince himself and everyone else that he was a good enough man to love Grace, despite her parentage. And I'd been the collateral damage of that desperate performance, the biological daughter whose competence only highlighted the favor he was showing to the child who wasn't genetically his. My entire childhood of feeling like I didn't measure up suddenly made terrible, sad sense. The revelation also explained my mother's behavior in her final years. The entries about Victor's escalating stalking took on new meaning. He hadn't just been punishing her for leaving, he'd been circling back toward a daughter he'd never gotten to claim. When my mother wrote that Victor knew about the girls, and that her greatest fear was him hurting us, she hadn't meant both daughters equally. She'd meant Grace specifically, the biological child Victor could use to destroy everything she'd built. I was still processing all of this when my phone lit up with an incoming call. Grace's name appeared on the screen, and for a moment I considered not answering. What could I possibly say to her? How do you tell someone that their entire identity is built on a lie? That the father who raised them isn't their father, and that the mentor who'd been guiding them is actually their biological parent, using them as an instrument of revenge? But the phone kept ringing, and some part of me, the part that had spent 6 years protecting Grace from consequences she never saw coming, couldn't let it go to voicemail. I answered on the 5th ring. "Natalie?" Grace's voice was barely recognizable through her sobbing. "He told me. Victor told me everything. About Mom, about Thomas, about him being my father. Oh God. Natalie, is it true? Please tell me it's not true." My heart shattered. "Grace, where are you right now?" "I'm at his office, at Westlake. He invited me here to discuss the family situation, and then he showed me the DNA test and told me he's been waiting 20 years to tell me the truth. He said Mom stole me from him, and that Thomas has been lying to me my whole life, and that you probably knew and never told me, and—" Her words dissolved into incoherent crying. "Grace, listen to me very carefully." I kept my voice as calm as I could manage while my pulse hammered in my ears. "You need to leave that office right now. Don't explain, don't argue. Just tell him you need air and walk out. Can you do that? He said I've been helping him destroy Bowen Corp, she whispered. He said that was the plan all along, to use me to tear apart the family that kept me from him. Natalie, what have I done? Before Natalie could decide what to do, her phone rang. It was Grace sobbing. He told me everything, and I think I've been helping him destroy us. I talked Grace through leaving Westlake's office building, staying on the line, while she made excuses about feeling ill and needing fresh air. I could hear Victor's voice in the background, smooth and unconcerned, telling her to take all the time you need, sweetheart. The endearment made my skin crawl. Once she was safely in her car, I gave her the address of a small cafe 40 minutes north of Portsmouth, far enough from both Westlake and Bowen Corp that we'd have privacy. She arrived 2 hours later, looking like she'd aged a decade in a week. Her designer suit was wrinkled makeup smeared from crying, and her hands shook so badly she could barely hold the coffee cup I ordered for her. We sat in a corner booth of the nearly empty cafe, late afternoon sunlight slanting through the windows and illuminating the devastation on my sister's face. "Tell me everything," I said quietly. "From the beginning." Grace wrapped both hands around her coffee cup like it was the only thing anchoring her to reality. 3 years ago, I was at a business technology conference in Boston. I was feeling so inadequate. You'd just solved that crisis with the Meridian contract and everyone was talking about how brilliant you were, and I was just the VP who showed up for photo opportunities. She laughed bitterly. Victor approached me at the cocktail hour. He said he'd been following Bowen Corp's progress and that he saw something special in me that other people overlooked. He said I had visionary thinking that was being held back by conservative management approaches. I stayed silent, letting her talk. He was so charming, Natalie, so interested in my ideas. He asked me about my vision for the company, and I told him all these ambitious plans I had, and he didn't laugh or tell me they were unrealistic. He said I was exactly the kind of bold thinker the defense industry needed. Grace's voice cracked. He positioned himself as this mentor who finally saw my potential. He'd call every few weeks with strategic advice, always framing it as helping me prove myself. He said things like, "Your sister is technically brilliant, but she lacks the courage to think big. You have that courage. You just need to learn to trust your instincts over her caution." She described how Victor had gradually escalated his involvement, suggesting she take more visible leadership roles, encouraging her to push for faster timelines and bigger contracts. Every piece of advice had sounded like empowerment in the moment. He told me to take credit for the projects you were actually completing. He said, "In a male-dominated industry, women need to learn to promote themselves. Your sister does the technical work, but you provide the vision that's equally valuable." So I started doing press interviews about projects I barely understood, and he'd coach me on what to say. "The $50 million contract," I said, needing to understand that specific disaster. Grace closed her eyes. "He helped me negotiate that. He said, great leaders take risks that cautious people fear. Your sister will try to talk you out of this because she's threatened by your boldness, but you need to prove you can make big decisions." The timeline, the specifications, the penalty clauses, he guided me through all of it. He made it sound like I was finally stepping out of your shadow. She opened her eyes, tears streaming down her face. "It was sabotage, wasn't it? Every word of advice was designed to make me fail." "Yes," I said simply because she deserved the truth. "Every time I made a mistake and you fixed it, he'd call me and say, 'See how your sister swoops in to undermine you. She wants you to look incompetent so she can maintain control. Don't let her steal your victories.'" I believed him, Natalie. I actually believed you were sabotaging me when you were saving me. Grace's voice rose with anguish. "I saw your help as a tax. I saw your competence as competition. He poisoned everything." The worst part was still coming. I could see it in the way Grace's hands were shaking harder, the way she couldn't meet my eyes. "A week before Dad slapped you," she whispered, "Victor invited me to a private meeting. He said we needed to address the Natalie situation before she damaged my career permanently. He helped me build a presentation for Dad, 30 slides of evidence that you were controlling, undermining, and systematically trying to make me fail. He twisted facts, manipulated timelines, made your crisis management look like interference. The presentation painted you as the problem standing between Bowen Corp and success. I felt cold all over. You showed that to Dad. I presented it to him 2 days before the board meeting. I watched him get angrier and angrier as he read through it, and I felt... She choked on the word. I felt victorious, like I was finally standing up for myself against your control. When he slapped you in that meeting, part of me was horrified, but another part... Her voice broke completely. Another part felt like I'd won. Oh God, Natalie, I'm a monster. You're not a monster, I said, though my own pain was making it hard to speak. You were manipulated by someone who's been planning this for decades. I handed him the weapon. Grace said each word like broken glass. I aimed it at you. I pulled the trigger through Dad's hand. And when you got hurt, when you walked out of that boardroom with your cheek red and your eyes so empty, I felt triumphant for about 30 seconds before the victory turned to ash. But by then, it was too late. She was sobbing openly now, and I reached across the table to take her shaking hands. I was angry, God, I was so angry about so many things, but looking at my sister's complete breakdown, I also saw what Victor had seen someone whose desperate need for approval made her the perfect puppet. He'd played her insecurities like a virtuoso. I don't deserve forgiveness, Grace said. But I need you to know that the person who hurt you wasn't entirely me. I was puppeteered, but I let myself be because it felt good to finally win against you. That's the part that makes me sick. I wanted to believe I was better than you, so I let myself be used as a weapon. I looked at my broken sister, my half-sister technically, though that fact seemed less important than it had hours ago, and realized that Victor's greatest crime wasn't just sabotaging a company. It was taking two sisters who could have been allies and turning them into enemies, then forcing them both to live with the consequences of choices neither of them had fully understood they were making. There's something else Victor told you, isn't there? I said quietly, watching her face. Something about what he plans to do next. Grace took a shaking breath and gripped her coffee cup so tightly I worried it might shatter. 3 days before the board meeting where Dad slapped you, Victor invited me to a private meeting. Not his office, a suite at the Mandarin Oriental in Boston. He said it was a strategy session for my future and that the setting needed to be private because what he was going to share was sensitive. I felt my stomach tighten. What happened there? When I arrived, there was a presentation folder waiting for me on the conference table in the suite. My name was embossed on it in gold lettering, Grace Bowen, Strategic Vision for Bowen Corp 2024-2029. It made me feel so important, Natalie, like someone finally saw me as a serious leader. Her voice was thick with self-loathing. Victor had prepared this incredibly detailed PowerPoint presentation. Financial projections, market analyses, competitive positioning, it all looked so professional, so legitimate. And she described how Victor had walked her through his plan step by step, framing each stage as strategic business maneuvering. First, he explained they needed to create separation between Natalie and the company through a catalyst event that would demonstrate Natalie's inability to function as a team player. He'd actually used those words. The catalyst he suggested should be Grace confronting Natalie's controlling behavior in front of the board, forcing Thomas to choose between his daughter's competing visions for the company. He told me that once you were sidelined, I'd have 6 months to establish myself as sole leader. But here's the part that makes me sick. Grace's hands were trembling so badly now that coffee sloshed onto the table. He said he'd be feeding me aggressive growth strategies that would temporarily destabilize the company's value, but would ultimately position us for a breakthrough. He showed me projections of Bowen Corp's stock price dropping by 60% over 6 months, then recovering to triple its original value once we'd shed outdated operational models. He was planning to crash the stock price deliberately, I said, understanding flooding through me. With you as the instrument. Yes. And then he promised that once the price had bottomed out, He'd help me buy out the board using financing he'd arrange. I'd emerge as the majority owner of a rebuilt Bowen Corp, and he'd be my strategic partner. He made it sound like I'd finally get everything I deserved: control of the company, recognition for my vision, freedom from your shadow. Grace pressed her palms against her eyes. He told me I reminded him of my mother, brilliant visionary held back by people who didn't understand me. He didn't say our mother. He didn't tell me he was my father. He just manipulated me with the comparison. She described how Victor had given her a burner phone, explaining that their strategic consultations needed to remain confidential to avoid alerting competitors or conservative board members who might resist bold moves. He'd made her feel like she was part of an exclusive inner circle, privy to executive-level strategy that ordinary people couldn't understand. Then he showed me emails. Grace said, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. Emails supposedly from you to executives at Raytheon and Lockheed discussing your plans to leave Bowen Corp and start a competing firm. He said you'd been secretly recruiting our best engineers and planning to take our client relationships with you. The emails looked real, Natalie. They had your signature, your writing style, even references to projects only you would know about. They were forged, I said, though the words felt inadequate for the sophistication of Victor's deception. I know that now, but at the time I believed I was protecting our family's company from your betrayal. Victor helped me draft talking points for Dad's specific phrases that would trigger his worst fears about you. He coached me on how to present the evidence, when to pause for emotional impact, how to frame your crisis management as proof of controlling behavior. Grace's voice broke. We rehearsed it, Natalie, like actors preparing for a performance. He'd play Dad, and I'd practice my presentation until he was satisfied I'd deliver it with the right combination of hurt and anger. The image of Grace and Victor rehearsing how to destroy me was almost too much to process. What else did he say at that meeting? Grace's face went even paler. At the end, after I'd agreed to everything he said, something that seemed odd at the time but is terrifying now that I know the truth. He said, if Natalie tries to return and save the company, and she will because that's her nature, I'll handle her permanently. I asked what he meant, and he just smiled and said, don't worry about your sister. Focus on your role. I'll make sure nothing interferes with your success. A chill ran down my spine. Grace, when did he tell you he was your biological father? Yesterday. After I'd already executed his entire plan, after I'd helped engineer your humiliation after the company had started collapsing. That's when he revealed the DNA test and told me the truth about Mom and him and everything. And that's when I understood what permanently might actually mean. Grace grabbed my hand across the table, her grip desperate. Natalie, I saw Mom's journal entries and the documentation he showed me. I saw how he stalked her, how she was terrified of him, how she died on her way to get a restraining order. What if handling you permanently means... I know, I said, cutting her off before she could complete the thought that was already haunting me. I found Mom's journals too. I know what he's capable of. Grace's eyes were wild with fear and guilt. He's not done. This isn't just about the company anymore. Maybe it never was. He said something else right before I left his office yesterday. He said, there's insurance in place to ensure Natalie can't rebuild what we're tearing down. Someone on the inside who understands that loyalty has a price. Natalie. He has someone on the board working for him. Someone who'll make sure that even if you try to fight back, you'll lose everything. Did he tell you who? No. He just smiled and said I'd figure it out eventually, and that when I did, I'd understand how thoroughly he'd planned all of this. Grace's grip on my hand tightened until it was almost painful. He's been 10 steps ahead of us for years. Every move we've made, he anticipated. Every defense we've built, he already knew how to dismantle. And now he's watching us try to piece together the truth while he's already moving on to whatever comes next. I looked at my sister's terrified face and realized we were both finally seeing the same enemy, finally on the same side, but possibly too late to stop what Victor had set in motion years ago. Grace grabbed Natalie's hand desperately. He's not done. He said if you fight back, there's a board member already paid to make sure you lose everything, but he wouldn't tell me who. I received the formal invitation to join the emergency board meeting via video conference at 9 a.m., 3 days after my conversation with Grace. Jennifer texted me the background: 3 more major clients had terminated contracts overnight. 2 significant shareholders had filed notice of intent to sue for gross mismanagement, and the board had convened in crisis mode with Thomas looking, in Jennifer's words, like a dead man walking. I set up my laptop in the bed and breakfast's sunroom, positioning myself so the morning light from the harbor would backlight me slightly, making my expression harder to read on camera. When I joined the video call, I could see the entire board assembled around the conference table that had witnessed my humiliation a week earlier. Thomas sat at the head looking diminished and gray. Grace was noticeably absent. Margaret Chen sat with her arms crossed, her expression carved from stone. Richard Sorensen, the CFO, was mid-presentation when I joined. He paused, acknowledged my presence with a tight nod, then continued laying out the financial devastation. Without the contracts Natalie personally managed, and I emphasize personally as these relationships were structured around her direct involvement, Bowen Corp will be insolvent within 4 months. We're currently projecting losses of $87 million through Q4 with no viable path to recovery under current management structure. This is unconscionable, Margaret Chen said, her voice cutting through the room's tense silence. She stood, and I noticed her hands were shaking with what looked like rage. Thomas, you slapped the only person keeping this company alive. You didn't discipline an employee. You committed corporate suicide in front of witnesses, and now you're sitting there expecting us to help you clean up the blood. Thomas flinched but said nothing. Another director, Howard Phillips, leaned forward and said, "We need to discuss immediate remediation. I propose we formally extend an offer to Natalie to return as permanent CEO with full operational authority, and that we simultaneously remove Thomas as board chairman pending a review of his fitness to serve." Seconded, Margaret said immediately. Wait! Grace's voice came from off-camera, and then she appeared at the edge of the frame looking like she'd been crying for days. This isn't entirely Dad's fault. I was getting advice from a consultant who... Victor Hartwell, I said quietly, and the room went silent. That's who was advising you, Grace. You can say his name. Grace nodded miserably. Yes, Victor Hartwell. He's been mentoring me for 3 years, and I thought... Margaret Chen's face went absolutely white. She sat down heavily, her hand pressed against her chest. Victor Hartwell has been advising this company. Her voice was barely above a whisper. For 3 years. You know him? Thomas asked, confusion evident in his tone. I worked here when Elizabeth was still alive, Margaret said, and I saw her struggling to control her breathing. I was here when she was trying to get a restraining order against her ex-husband. Victor Hartwell is a corporate raider who specializes in destroying companies from the inside. He cultivates relationships with vulnerable executives, feeds them advice designed to create catastrophic failures, then acquires the companies for pennies on the dollar once they've collapsed. He's done it to at least 6 other firms that I know of. She looked directly at the camera at me. Your mother tried to warn Thomas about him before she died. She told me Victor would never stop circling this company because destroying it was his way of punishing her for leaving him. The revelation hit the board like a shockwave. I watched realization dawn on face after face. This wasn't family dysfunction. This was systematic sabotage orchestrated over years by someone with both the capability and the pathological motivation to see Bowen Corp destroyed. If that's true, Richard said slowly, then we're not just facing financial crisis. We're facing corporate espionage charges, potential criminal conspiracy, and the only person who's been successfully defending against these attacks without even knowing they were attacks, Margaret interrupted, is Natalie, who Thomas slapped and suspended for trying to protect us from the latest trap. The silence that followed was suffocating. Finally, Howard Phillips said, Ms. Bowen, we would like to formally invite you to return as CEO with full authority. We're prepared to offer whatever compensation and terms you require. I let the silence stretch for a few seconds, watching them squirm. Then I said very calmly, "I will return on one condition. I want 70% equity control of Bowen Corp, or I will take my patents, my client relationships, and my proprietary knowledge to a competitor." The room erupted. Thomas's head snapped up, shock breaking through his defeated expression. Richard started to speak, then stopped. Margaret simply stared at me through the camera, and I saw the ghost of a smile on her face. "That's impossible," Howard sputtered. 70% would require— "Let me be very clear," I said, my voice cutting through the chaos. 8 years ago, I founded NatTech Labs as an independent research entity. Using my own resources, my own time, and my own facilities, I developed 27 patents that form the technological foundation of Bowen Corp's current product line. Those patents belong to me personally, not to this company. Bowen Corp has been licensing them under an agreement that specifically terminates if I'm no longer serving as CEO. I pulled up a document on my screen and shared it to the call. "This is the licensing agreement your predecessors signed. Note Section 7.3 License Termination Conditions. Without these patents, every product Bowen Corp currently manufactures becomes obsolete or legally unproducible within 6 months. I'm not asking for 70% control. I'm stating the terms under which I'll allow this company to continue using the intellectual property that keeps it viable." Richard was scrolling through something on his tablet, his face growing more ashen by the second. "She's right. The core guidance systems, the integrated architecture, the predictive maintenance algorithms, they're all licensed from NatTech Labs. If she terminates the agreement, we have nothing to sell." "How long have you been planning this?" Thomas asked, his voice hollow. I looked directly at my father through the camera and said something I'd been holding inside for 8 years. "Since the day I turned 25 and realized this family would never choose me. So I chose myself. I built a backup plan, a safety net, and a future that didn't require your approval or your affection. Every time you blamed me for Grace's mistakes, every time you credited her for my successes, every time you made it clear I was only valuable when I was serving your interests, I was documenting it, preparing for it, and ensuring that when the inevitable breaking point came, I'd walk away with power instead of just pain." The board sat in stunned silence. Margaret Chen was the first to speak. 70%, she said quietly. "What are your other terms?" The board went into closed session for 90 minutes while I remained on video standby, watching the harbor through my window and feeling remarkably calm for someone who'd just issued an ultimatum that would either save or permanently destroy her family's company. When they finally invited me back to the call, Margaret Chen's expression told me they'd reached some kind of consensus, though it clearly hadn't been painless. "We can't give you 70%, Margaret said directly. "The capital structure won't support it without diluting existing shareholders below legal thresholds for voting rights and fiduciary protections. However, we have a counter-proposal that we believe addresses your concerns while remaining legally viable." Richard Sorensen pulled up a presentation that had clearly been assembled in haste. "We're proposing 51% controlling interest achieved through 2 mechanisms. First, new stock issuance from authorized but unissued shares, which will give you an additional 19%. Second, direct purchase of shares from Thomas's personal holdings at fair market value, currently assessed at $4,200,000, which will give you the remaining equity needed for majority control." I watched Thomas's face on the video call. He looked like a man hearing his own death sentence. "Additional terms," Margaret continued. "You have final authority on all strategic decisions as majority shareholder and CEO. Grace will be removed from all executive positions immediately, though she can remain employed as a director-level employee if she completes a third-party leadership training program and passes a competency review. Thomas steps down as board chairman effective immediately, but retains a non-voting board seat for continuity purposes. All of this is contingent on you signing a 5-year commitment to remain as CEO and maintain the NatTech licensing agreement." The terms were better than I'd expected and more humiliating for Thomas than I'd dared hope for. I agree to those terms, I said. With one addition, I want an independent audit of all advisory relationships the company has maintained in the past 5 years, with particular attention to any entities connected to Victor Hartwell or Westlake Industries. And I want full authority to terminate any relationships found to be compromising. Agreed, Margaret said immediately, and I saw several other board members nodding. Now, regarding the financial aspect of the share purchase, $4.2 million is substantial. Do you require time to arrange financing or, I don't need financing? I said and shared my screen to display documentation I'd prepared the night before. Nattech Labs has generated $8.3 million in licensing revenue over 8 years from Bowen Corp. And 7 other clients in the defense and aerospace sectors. My real estate portfolio, consisting of 3 properties purchased during market downturns, is currently valued at $2.1 million. And my investment fund, Nattech Women's Innovation Fund, manages $4.3 million in assets. My personal liquid net worth is approximately $6.7 million. The $4.2 million share purchase can be completed within 72 hours via wire transfer. The silence on the call was absolute. I watched the board members' faces cycle through shock, confusion, and in some cases, what looked like shame. Howard Phillips finally said, You've been wealthier than any of us realized this entire time." "Yes," I said simply. "Why did you never tell your father?" Margaret asked, her voice gentle but pointed. I looked directly at Thomas through the camera. His face had gone gray. Because my worth was never about money to him. I could have been a billionaire and he still would have preferred Grace. Money wouldn't have changed the fundamental equation of our relationship, that I was valued for my usefulness, and Grace was valued for her existence. So I stopped seeking his approval and started building my own empire. Every time he dismissed my competence, I was licensing another patent. Every time he credited Grace for my work, I was acquiring another property. Every time he made it clear I only mattered when I was serving the family's interests, I was investing in women who actually appreciated what I could offer them. Thomas made a sound like he'd been struck. Margaret Chen closed her eyes briefly, and when she opened them, there were tears on her cheeks. "Your mother would be so proud of you," she whispered. The final documents took another hour to prepare. David Hutchins, the company attorney, drew up the stock transfer agreements with uncharacteristic speed, probably motivated by the shared understanding that every hour of delay increased the risk of Victor making another move. When the documents were ready, they were sent to Thomas's tablet for electronic signature. I watched my father stare at the screen for a long time, his finger hovering over the signature field. His hand was shaking visibly. This wasn't just a business transaction, it was an admission that he'd failed as both a father and a leader, that he'd elevated the wrong daughter, trusted the wrong people, and destroyed what his wife had helped build through his own weakness and pride. Margaret Chen, sitting beside him, said quietly, "Thomas, your wife told me something before she died. She said Natalie was the strongest person she'd ever known, and that someday Natalie would save this company not from competitors, but from the family itself. She said you were too proud to see it then, but that eventually you'd have no choice but to understand what you had in your daughter." Margaret paused. Elizabeth was right about everything. Thomas's signature appeared on the screen, shaky and irregular, nothing like his usual confident scrawl. The document processing system confirmed receipt, and just like that, I became the majority owner of Bowen Corp., the company my mother had co-founded that my father had nearly destroyed, and that I'd been holding together with invisible threads for 6 years was now mine to control. "The transfer is complete," David confirmed. "Natalie Bowen is now the controlling shareholder with 51% equity interest and full decision-making authority as CEO. I felt something shift inside me. Not triumph exactly, but a settling into place of something that had been misaligned my entire life. I'd finally stopped being my father's disappointing daughter and become my mother's worthy heir. That's when Jennifer's face appeared at the edge of the video frame, pale and urgent. She was holding her phone up so the board could see the screen. I'm sorry to interrupt, but you need to see this. It just hit the news. And the headline flashed across the boardroom's presentation screen. Westlake Industries announces hostile takeover bid for Bowen Corp. Offers $127 for company. Valued at $300 an. Claims. Fatal management decline. Justifies discount. Victor had made his move while we were still signing documents, and he was coming for everything. The media attack began exactly 4 hours after I signed the controlling interest documents, which told me Victor had been monitoring our corporate filings in real time and had his response ready to deploy the moment I took power. By 6 p.m., my phone was flooded with news alerts, each headline more vicious than the last. Bowen Corp heir seizes control in family coup, ran across Bloomberg. The Wall Street Journal's business section featured, New CEO's suspicious wealth raises questions about asset stripping. Reuters published a detailed analysis based on leaked internal documents, claiming I'd been systematically siphoning company resources into personal ventures for years. The documents were sophisticated fabrications close enough to reality to seem credible, altered enough to paint me as a criminal rather than an independent entrepreneur. The coordinated nature of the attack was breathtaking in its precision. Anonymous sources quoted in multiple outlets claimed I'd used company resources to develop patents I'd registered personally, that my investment fund was actually a vehicle for laundering money from Bowen Corp., that my real estate purchases had been financed through fraudulent loans using company assets as collateral. None of it was true, but the lies were complex enough that disproving them would require weeks of forensic accounting while my reputation burned to ash. Bowen Corp's stock price, already battered from the contract losses, went into freefall. By market close, we'd dropped 23% in a single trading day. My inbox filled with emails from investors' attorneys suggesting class action lawsuits for breach of fiduciary duty. The SEC's Enforcement Division sent a formal inquiry requesting documentation of my personal financial transactions. Victor had turned my legitimately earned wealth, the very thing that should have proved my competence, into evidence of corruption. I was in Portsmouth drafting a response strategy with Marcus and a crisis communications firm when Jennifer forwarded me a link with the message, "Grace just went rogue. Press conference in 10 minutes. She didn't tell anyone she was doing this." I pulled up the live stream to see my sister standing at a podium in Bowen Corp's main conference room, looking terrified but determined. Her eyes were red from crying, her hands shook as she adjusted the microphone, and she'd clearly dressed in haste. Her blouse was wrinkled and she wore minimal makeup. Behind her stood no PR team, no attorneys, no handlers. Just Grace alone facing a room full of journalists who'd spent the day eviscerating her family. "My name is Grace Bowen," she began, her voice wavering but clear. "And I'm here to tell you the truth about what's been happening at my family's company, because my sister Natalie doesn't deserve what's being done to her, and I'm the reason she's vulnerable to it." I watched in stunned silence as Grace systematically dismantled her own public image. She confessed to years of incompetence, describing specific projects she'd mismanaged and contracts she'd endangered. She explained how a consultant named Victor Hartwell had mentored her for 3 years, feeding her advice that seemed strategic but was actually designed to sabotage the company. She admitted providing him with internal information making decisions against Natalie's counsel and actively working to undermine her sister's authority. Then Grace held up a document to the cameras. "This is a DNA test from 20 years ago. It proves that Victor Hartwell is my biological father, though I only learned this 2 days ago. He used our relationship, my desperate need for approval and validation, to manipulate me into becoming a weapon against my own family. Every mistake I made, he engineered. Every time my sister Natalie saved me from the consequences of those mistakes, he convinced me she was undermining me out of jealousy. He turned me against the one person who'd been protecting me my entire life." Her voice broke, but she continued. "The man who is now attacking Natalie, publicly claiming she's corrupt and incompetent, is the same man who spent 3 years systematically destroying our company from within, using me as his instrument. Everything he's saying about her is a lie. Everything he told me about her was a lie. and I was stupid enough, vain enough, and broken enough to believe him. Grace looked directly into the camera. My sister is the most competent person I've ever known. She's been cleaning up my messes for 6 years while I took credit for her work. She built an independent fortune because our father made it clear she'd never be valued in our family, and she did it ethically and legally while I was being groomed to commit corporate sabotage. I am deeply, deeply sorry for what I've done to her, and I'm prepared to face any legal consequences for providing confidential information to someone who was actively working to destroy us. The press conference erupted into shouted questions, but Grace simply walked away from the podium, leaving the journalists scrambling. The live stream cut off, and I sat staring at my laptop screen with tears running down my face. Grace had just sacrificed everything, her reputation, her career, possibly her freedom, to give me a defense against Victor's smear campaign. Within the hour, the narrative began to shift. Journalists started digging into Westlake Industries' history. Several publications ran stories about corporate raiders using family members as unwitting accomplices. The SEC inquiry into my finances was quietly suspended pending review of additional contextual information. Grace's confession hadn't cleared me completely, but it had complicated Victor's attack enough to buy me time. That's when my phone rang from an unlisted number. I almost didn't answer, but something made me accept the call. Natalie Bowen. Victor's voice was smooth, controlled, utterly devoid of warmth. Your mother thought she could embarrass me too. She went to the press with accusations, tried to get a restraining order, made herself into a victim for public consumption. She learned the price of defiance. My blood went cold. Are you confessing to murdering my mother? I'm observing that women who make themselves problems tend to have unfortunate accidents. Your mother's car went off the road on a rainy night. Grace was supposed to destroy you quietly from the inside so no one would connect her failures to me. But since she's too weak to follow through, I'll handle you myself. His voice hardened. You have 72 hours before I release information that will not just ruin Bowen Corp. It will ruin you personally. Everything you've built, everyone who trusts you, all of it will burn. And unlike your mother, you won't see it coming. The line went dead before I could respond. I sat holding the phone, my hand shaking, trying to process whether Victor had just threatened to kill me or merely to destroy me. The distinction felt uncomfortably academic. Jennifer's text arrived an hour later, and the words made my stomach drop. Grace never came home from the press conference. Building security shows her getting into a car with Westlake Industries plates at 7:47 p.m. Natalie, I think she's with him. I called Grace's phone 17 times in the first hour after Jennifer's text, each call going straight to voicemail. By hour 3, I'd contacted her apartment building's security manager and had him pull footage from the lobby cameras. The video showed exactly what Jennifer had described Grace, walking out at 11:47 p.m. Her posture determined, rather than fearful, climbing into a black sedan with Westlake Industries corporate plates. No one forced her. No one even touched her. She'd gone willingly. The panic was starting to override my ability to think strategically when I found the envelope on my doorstep the next morning. My name in Grace's looping handwriting, the paper slightly crumpled like she'd been gripping it too tightly when she wrote it. Inside was a single page, the words rushed but legible. Natalie, I know you'll try to stop me, so I'm writing this before I go. Victor called and asked to meet, to discuss our relationship as father and daughter. I know it's a trap. Oh, I'm not stupid anymore, or at least I'm trying not to be. But I'm going anyway because I'm wearing the recording device you taught me about. Remember 2 years ago when I accidentally recorded that board meeting on my smartwatch and panicked? You showed me how to delete it, but you also showed me how it worked, how it could capture audio even when the screen was off. I bought a new one, same model, and I've set it to auto-upload to your secure cloud if I don't manually stop it within 24 hours. If I can get him to confess what he's done, we can stop him legally. I spent my whole life being the stupid sister. Let me be smart just once. If I'm not back in 24 hours, check the cloud. I love you. I'm sorry for everything. G. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the paper. Grace had gone to confront a man who'd possibly murdered our mother, armed with nothing but a smart watch and a desperate need to prove she could do something right. The plan was either brilliantly brave or suicidally reckless, and I couldn't decide which. I immediately called Marcus and had him try to track Grace's phone, but it had been powered off either by Grace to avoid being tracked or by Victor for the same reason. I considered calling the police, spent 10 minutes drafting a missing person report, then stopped. Grace was a 28-year-old adult who'd left voluntarily with someone she knew. The police wouldn't act for at least 48 hours, and any evidence Grace obtained while under police surveillance would be legally compromised. If her plan was going to work, it had to work without official intervention. Instead, I pulled up Grace's location history from her cloud backup. She'd never changed the password I'd helped her set up 3 years ago, and identified 3 Westlake properties where Victor might take her. The most likely was their main office building in Boston's financial district, a glass tower with executive suites on the top 3 floors. I called Derek Morrison, a former Marine I'd funded through my investment network, who now ran a private security consulting firm, and asked him to meet me in Boston within 2 hours. We positioned ourselves in a cafe across from the Westlake building with clear sightlines to the entrance. Derek had brought surveillance equipment that made my amateur detective work look laughably inadequate. "If she comes out and she's in distress, I can intervene," he said quietly. "But if she walks out on her own, we follow her to make sure she gets somewhere safe. Those are the rules you asked for, right?" "Right," I said, though every instinct was screaming at me to storm the building immediately. The hours passed with excruciating slowness. 11 hours, 15 hours, 20 hours. Derek brought coffee and sandwiches that I couldn't eat. My phone battery died and recharged twice. Every time the building's revolving doors moved, my heart rate spiked. At 21 hours and 43 minutes after Grace had entered the building, she emerged. I saw her before Derek did, stumbling slightly as she pushed through the doors, her hair disheveled and her jacket missing. Even from across the street, I could see she was shaking. Derek was already moving, crossing traffic with practiced efficiency, reaching her just as her knees started to buckle. I got to them 30 seconds later. Grace's left wrist had an angry red mark that would definitely bruise, and there were tear tracks through her makeup. But she was conscious, coherent, and when she saw me, she started laughing, a slightly hysterical sound that scared me almost as much as the bruise. "I got it," she said, holding up her wrist to show me the smartwatch still clasped there. "He found it about 2 hours in, grabbed my wrist, and tried to rip it off, but I convinced him it was just a fitness tracker. I showed him the step count screen and told him he could disable it if he wanted, that I didn't care about my workout data. He was so contemptuous of the idea that I'd care about something that trivial, that he believed me. He had no idea it was still recording after he disabled it." Derek got us into his car and drove to a hotel 3 blocks away where he'd already secured a room under a false name. Once we were inside with the door locked and security checked, Grace finally broke down, crying so hard she could barely breathe. I held her while she shook, feeling the terror she'd been suppressing for 22 hours finally release. When she could speak again, she pulled up her watch's app on her phone and showed me the audio file. 4 hours and 17 minutes of recorded conversation. "I got him to confess to sabotaging Bowen Corp.," she said, her voice raw. "He admitted paying Helen Crane $500,000 over 3 years to feed him internal information. He talked about how he manipulated me, how he'd been planning this for decades." She paused, fresh tears running down her face. "And Natalie, he described Mom's accident. He talked about ensuring the brake line failure looked mechanical, and how rainy nights are statistically more dangerous for women who don't maintain their vehicles properly. He as good as confessed to murdering her." I felt like I couldn't breathe. "Grace, this is enough to prosecute him. There's one more thing on the recording." Grace interrupted, her voice dropping to a whisper. "He said Thomas has been taking money from him too. $500,000 a year for 10 years. He called Dad his insurance policy and said he bought Thomas's compliance so cheaply it was almost insulting. I spent the night securing Grace's recording in multiple encrypted locations and contacting the criminal defense attorney my mother had worked with years ago. He confirmed what I'd suspected. Grace's recording was legally admissible under one-party consent laws in Massachusetts, and the content was potentially sufficient to support charges ranging from corporate espionage to conspiracy to commit murder. But he also warned me that Victor would have expensive attorneys who'd challenge everything, and that we needed more than just Grace's testimony and a single recording. That's when I remembered the USB drive my mother had left me, and specifically the file labeled Margaret Foster, Emergency Contact. I'd assumed it was just a name for reference, but now I wondered if it was an instruction. I called Margaret Chen the next morning, and she gave me Margaret Foster's contact information without hesitation. "Your mother trusted her more than anyone," Margaret Chen said quietly. "If Elizabeth left you her name, there's a reason." Margaret Foster lived in a converted farmhouse 40 minutes outside Portsmouth, surrounded by gardens that showed the same meticulous care I remembered in my mother's planning. She was 68, with silver hair pulled back in a practical bun, and eyes that assessed me with the sharp intelligence of someone who'd spent decades evaluating witnesses and evidence. She invited me in without preamble, led me to her study, and said simply, "I've been waiting 5 years for you to contact me. Your mother said you'd come when you were ready." She produced a key from her desk drawer and drove us to a bank in Portland, where she maintained a safe deposit box, under both her name and my mother's estate. Inside was a manila envelope thick with documents, a USB drive labeled, "Complete PI Report, do not open until ready," and a small evidence bag containing what looked like a section of metal tubing. "That's from your mother's brake line," Margaret said, her voice steady despite the weight of what she was revealing. "She had her car serviced 3 weeks before she died because she noticed the brakes felt soft. The mechanic found evidence of tampering precise cuts that would cause gradual fluid loss rather than immediate failure. He photographed everything and gave the parts to your mother because he thought she was in danger. She was going to present this to the police along with everything else she'd compiled against Victor." The documents in the envelope were devastatingly thorough. Medical records from when my mother had sought treatment for anxiety and insomnia during the final months of her life, with notes from her doctor expressing concern about stalking behavior she'd reported. Private investigator reports documenting Victor following her to grocery stores, appearing at her office building, sitting in his car outside our house at night. Time-stamped photographs showing Victor's vehicle parked near her regular routes on multiple occasions. The pattern was undeniable and terrifying. "Your mother was building a criminal case," Margaret explained. "Stalking corporate espionage, attempted murder via the brake tampering, and conspiracy to commit fraud related to Bowen Corp. She had enough evidence to put Victor away for 20 years. She was going to file everything the morning after she died." The USB drive contained the full video message I'd only seen excerpts of before. In this version, my mother didn't just speak to the camera, she also played audio from conversations she'd secretly recorded with Thomas. I heard my father's voice strained and defensive. He said if I didn't cooperate, he'd take Grace from us through the courts. He has rights as her biological father, Elizabeth. Legal rights. My mother's voice responded tight with anger and fear. "You're letting him destroy Natalie's confidence for money. For $500,000 a year, you're willing to let him poison our family." "It's not about the money." Thomas's voice cracked. "He said he'd expose Grace's parentage, publicly file for custody, drag us through courts that might actually give him visitation rights. I couldn't let that happen. I thought if I cooperated, if I made him feel like he had some control, he'd leave us alone. I was wrong. I know I was wrong." Listening to this conversation that had happened months before my mother died, I finally understood the impossible position she'd been in. Thomas wasn't just weak, he'd been blackmailed with both money and the threat of losing Grace, and he'd made the catastrophic decision to comply rather than fight. My mother had been trying to protect all of us while dealing with a husband who'd been compromised and a threat who would stop at nothing. The final portion of the video showed my mother speaking directly to the camera 3 days before her death. "Natalie, I failed to protect you from a broken family, but I'm trying to protect you from something worse. Victor won't stop until he destroys everyone I loved. I'm going to the police tomorrow with all of this evidence. If I don't survive and you're watching this, it means the fight falls to you now." Her voice broke slightly. "Don't let grief stop you. Be the woman I know you are, stronger than me, smarter than him, and brave enough to bring light to what I left in shadow. The most important thing, forgive your father. He's weak, but he's not evil. He made terrible choices out of fear, just like I did when I married Victor in the first place. We're all just trying to protect what we love, even when we do it badly." I was crying openly by the end, and Margaret handed me tissues without comment. We sat in silence for several minutes before she spoke again. "There's one more thing," she said quietly. "Your mother's brake line wasn't the only thing Victor tampered with that week." Margaret Foster's revelation about additional tampering hung in the air, but before she could elaborate, my phone rang with an urgent call from Marcus. He'd found something in Victor's corporate structure that required immediate action, a shell company preparing to file for emergency acquisition rights based on Bowen Corp's imminent insolvency. We had perhaps 48 hours before Victor could leverage the courts to force a fire sale. I thanked Margaret, secured all the evidence in her safe deposit box with plans to retrieve it for legal proceedings, and drove back to Portsmouth to assemble what I was already mentally calling my war council. Within 6 hours, I'd gathered a team in the bed and breakfast's largest suite, Margaret Foster on video from her home, Marcus, with his laptops and corporate intelligence files, 2 corporate fraud specialists Marcus recommended, and 3 women from my investment fund, Patricia Chen, who had legal expertise from her previous career, Linda Morrison, who'd worked in financial journalism, and Sarah Kim, who specialized in crisis communications. We spent the night building a 3-pronged strategy. First, file emergency motions for restraining orders and preliminary injunctions to freeze Victor's hostile takeover attempt, arguing that it was based on fraudulent claims of mismanagement when he'd actually orchestrated that mismanagement himself. Second, submit a comprehensive evidence package to both the SEC and FBI documenting corporate espionage, securities fraud, stalking, and conspiracy to commit murder. Third, launch a controlled counter-narrative through journalists. Patricia and Linda had relationships with people who'd covered corporate malfeasance before and would understand the story's complexity. "The key is timing," Sarah said, sketching out a communications timeline. "We go public with the full story immediately after filing the legal motions, so Victor can't control the narrative." Grace's confession already softened the ground. Now we explain why she was confessing, not because she's incompetent, but because she was being manipulated by a predator. The emergency board meeting I'd called for the next morning had a different purpose than the directors expected. When everyone assembled physically in the boardroom, for those in Boston virtually for me, and several others, I didn't start with business updates or financial projections. I started with a single question directed at Helen Crane. "Helen, how much did Victor Hartwell pay you to betray this company?" The room went absolutely silent. Helen's face drained of color. "I don't know what you're talking about." I played the audio file from Grace's recording, the section where Victor's voice said clearly, "Helen's been very helpful. 500,000 over 3 years is a bargain for the access she's provided. She thinks I'm going to make her a VP at Westlake. I'm not, obviously, but she doesn't need to know that yet." Helen made a small sound like she'd been struck. I played another section where Helen's own voice came through, calling Victor during Grace's meeting to report on the board's response to Natalie's ownership consolidation. The evidence was irrefutable. "You've been feeding him information for 3 years," I said, keeping my voice level. "You've been reporting on every board decision, every financial projection, every strategic discussion. You helped him time his attacks for maximum damage." Helen started crying, her hands shaking as she gripped the edge of the table. "I'm 61 years old. My pension was cut by 40% in the last restructuring. I have 3 years until retirement and no savings because I put 2 kids through college and supported my mother through hospice. Victor offered me security, a VP position, $500,000, a future that didn't terrify me. I didn't think..." She sobbed. I didn't think it would go this far. I didn't know about Grace, about your mother, about any of it. I just thought I was helping with competitive intelligence." I felt a flash of anger, then something more complicated: recognition that Victor had found and exploited weakness wherever it existed, whether in Grace's need for validation, Thomas's fear of losing a daughter, or Helen's financial desperation. "Here's what's going to happen," I said. "You're going to provide full testimony to federal investigators about every interaction you've had with Victor, every piece of information you've given him, every instruction he's provided. In exchange, I won't press for criminal prosecution. You'll resign from the board immediately, but you can frame it as retirement for health reasons, which preserves your pension. That's the offer. You have 60 seconds to decide." Helen looked at me with something like desperate gratitude. "I accept. I'll tell them everything." Her testimony, combined with Grace's recording and my mother's documentation, created an evidence package that our legal team submitted to the FBI and SEC that afternoon. By evening, we'd filed emergency motions in federal court for preliminary injunctions blocking Victor's takeover attempt. Then Grace and I recorded our video statement. We sat side by side at my laptop, Grace looking directly at the camera with hard-won clarity, and me providing the factual framework. We explained everything. Victor's decades-long vendetta against our mother, his manipulation of Grace through their biological connection, his payment of Thomas and Helen to ensure compliance, the systematic destruction of Bowen Corp from within. We framed it as corporate predation, not family drama. "We're not the only victims," Grace said, her voice steady. "If Victor did this to us over decades, he's done it to others. We're asking anyone who's experienced similar manipulation by Westlake Industries to come forward. You're not alone, and together we can stop him." The video went live simultaneously with a press release distributed to major business media outlets. Within 24 hours, the response exceeded anything we'd anticipated. 6 former employees of companies Victor had destroyed contacted our legal team with eerily similar stories. Mentors who became manipulators, advice that led to disasters, patterns of sabotage disguised as strategy. 2 investigative journalists requested interviews. The narrative shifted from dysfunctional family to serial predator finally exposed. Westlake's stock price collapsed 34% over 2 days as investors fled, while Bowen Corp stabilized and even ticked upward as confidence returned. Public sentiment swung decisively in our favor. But Victor wasn't finished. The notice arrived via my attorney. Federal court had scheduled a preliminary injunction hearing for the following week, a public proceeding where both sides would present evidence to determine if Victor's takeover attempt should be frozen. The courtroom would be open to the press, and Victor's legal team had already issued a statement promising revelations that will expose the Bowen sisters' carefully constructed lies. He had one final card to play, and he was about to show it to the world. The federal courthouse in Boston filled with journalists an hour before our hearing was scheduled to begin. Federal court rules prohibited cameras, but nothing stopped the 40-plus reporters from packing the public gallery notebooks ready, preparing to live tweet and write real-time analysis of every word spoken. I sat at the plaintiff's table with our attorney James Richardson, a 58-year-old litigator Margaret Foster had recommended, who specialized in corporate fraud cases. Grace sat in the front row of the gallery, pale but composed, wearing a navy suit that made her look older and more serious than I'd ever seen her. Victor arrived with a team of 3 attorneys from one of Boston's most expensive firms, all of them carrying the kind of confidence that came from rarely losing. Victor himself looked impeccable in a charcoal suit, his silver hair perfectly styled, his expression one of mild amusement, as if this were all a tedious formality he'd indulge before getting back to real business. Judge Patricia Mendoza, a stern woman in her early 60s with a reputation for no-nonsense efficiency, called the proceedings to order. James stood and outlined our argument that Victor Hartwell had orchestrated a decade-long campaign of corporate sabotage against Bowen Corp through manipulation of family members and board insiders that his current hostile takeover bid was based on false claims of mismanagement he himself had engineered, and that we had substantial evidence warranting an immediate injunction to prevent further damage while criminal investigations proceeded. Victor's lead attorney, Marcus Webb, countered that this was a desperate attempt by a family in crisis to deflect blame for their own incompetence onto a respected business consultant who'd tried to help them. He characterized our evidence as family drama dressed up in legal language, and suggested the court dismiss our motion and allow market forces to determine Bowen Corp's fate. "The plaintiff may call their first witness," Judge Mendoza said. "We call Grace Bowen," James announced. I watched Victor's expression shift from amusement to confusion as Grace walked to the witness stand. He'd expected me to testify first to lead with the CEO's perspective. Calling Grace first was tactically brilliant. It meant Victor's team would have to attack a woman who'd already publicly confessed to being manipulated, making them look cruel rather than strategic. Grace was sworn in, her voice steady, her hands folded in her lap to hide their shaking. James took her through her testimony methodically, how Victor had approached her 3 years ago, how he'd cultivated her trust, how he'd provided advice that seemed strategic but consistently led to disasters Natalie had to fix. Grace described the hotel meeting where Victor had laid out his plan, the forged emails he'd shown her, the way he'd rehearsed with her how to trigger Thomas's anger. Then James asked, "Did you record your final meeting with Mr. Hartwell?" "Yes," Grace said. "I wore a smart watch with recording capability. Under Massachusetts one-party consent law, I was legally allowed to record our conversation without his knowledge because I was a participant." Marcus Webb objected, calling the recording obtained through deception, but Judge Mendoza overruled him. "One-party consent is clear law in this state, Counselor. Proceed." James played the audio. 4 minutes and 37 seconds of Victor's voice admitting he'd manipulated Grace, paid Helen Crane for information, and orchestrated Bowen Corp's decline. The courtroom was absolutely silent except for the recording. I watched several journalists typing furiously. When the audio reached the section about my mother, I ensured the accident wasn't entirely accidental. I saw Victor's jaw tighten. Marcus Webb stood for cross-examination, and I could see him calculating how to discredit Grace without appearing to bully a victim. "Ms. Bowen, you have a documented history of professional failures at Bowen Corp, don't you? Poor judgment, missed deadlines, costly mistakes." "Yes," Grace said steadily. "All of which occurred after receiving advice from Victor Hartwell, as I've testified. Or perhaps you simply lack competence and are now blaming—" James stood. "Your Honor, we have documentation proving each alleged failure was preceded by specific advice from Mr. Hartwell designed to produce that exact outcome. We'd like to enter Exhibit 14 through 27 into evidence." The exhibits were the timeline analyses Grace and I had prepared showing the direct correlation between Victor's contact and Grace's mistakes. Judge Mendoza reviewed them and nodded. "The witness's answer stands. Continue, Mr. Webb, but tread carefully." Webb had no effective counter. He sat down. We called Margaret Foster next. She testified about my mother's documentation, the stalking pattern, the brake line evidence. Then we called Rebecca Walsh, a former Westlake employee who'd been granted immunity in exchange for testimony. She was 53, nervous, but clear in her account. "I worked in Victor Hartwell's office for 4 years," she said. "I personally heard him say that Bowen Corp was unfinished business because Elizabeth Bowen had humiliated him by leaving and succeeding without him. When news came that Mrs. Bowen had died, Victor opened champagne in his office. I remember the date because it disturbed me so much. It was the day after her funeral." The gallery erupted in whispers. Judge Mendoza gavelled for silence. Then James did something I hadn't expected. He called Victor himself as a hostile witness. Victor took the stand with the same confident ease he'd displayed all day, but I could see calculation behind his eyes. James walked him through his relationship with my mother, his contact with Grace and Thomas, his business model at Westlake. Then James played the recording again, specifically the section about my mother's accident, and asked, "Mr. Hartwell, what did you mean when you said you ensured the accident wasn't entirely accidental?" That's taken out of context, Victor said smoothly. What's the context? I was speaking metaphorically about... You were speaking metaphorically about brake line tampering. Victor's composure finally cracked. That woman humiliated me. His voice rose, echoing through the courtroom. She left me, took my child, and built a life where I was erased like I never mattered. She had no right. Mr. Hartwell, Judge Mendoza warned. But Victor was beyond stopping. I had every right to take back what she stole, every right to make her pay for 30 years of... Mr. Hartwell, you will control yourself or be removed from this courtroom. Victor stood, his face flushed with rage. This is a travesty. These women are lying, manipulating. Judge Mendoza gestured to the bailiffs. Remove Mr. Hartwell for contempt and escort him from the courthouse. As the U.S. Marshals approached, Victor lunged toward the witness stand where Grace had testified earlier, shouting, "You're going to regret this. All of you, this doesn't end here." The marshals restrained him and dragged him from the courtroom. His screams echoed down the hallway. You think this ends in court? You have no idea what I've already set in motion. Judge Mendoza looked shaken but composed herself quickly. I'm granting the preliminary injunction in full. All Westlake Industries activities related to Bowen Corp are frozen pending criminal investigation. I'm also ordering this transcript expedited to federal prosecutors. This hearing is adjourned. 3 hours later, Jennifer called FBI agents just arrived at Bowen Corp with a warrant. They're seizing financial records. Natalie, I think they're investigating us, not Victor. The FBI agents arrived at Bowen Corp headquarters with the kind of precision that suggested they'd been planning the raid for days, which meant Victor had tipped them off well before our courtroom confrontation. Jennifer sent me photos of agents carrying boxes of financial records out of the building while employees stood watching in confused horror. The warrant, which our attorney obtained within an hour, alleged securities fraud, specifically that I had manipulated Bowen Corp's stock price through my resignation and strategic return to enable a below-market purchase of controlling shares. The accusation was sophisticated enough to sound plausible to anyone who didn't understand the full context. I'd resigned when the company was stable, the stock had crashed during my absence, and I'd returned to purchase majority control at the depressed price. On paper, it looked like textbook securities manipulation. The fact that the crash had been caused by Victor's decade-long sabotage, not my departure, required explanation that securities investigators wouldn't automatically accept. Within hours, the media narrative shifted again. Bowen Corp CEO under federal investigation for securities fraud ran across Bloomberg. The Wall Street Journal published an analysis suggesting my entire redemption arc had been carefully orchestrated theater to enable insider trading. Shareholders who'd just begun to trust me again filed new lawsuits. Everything we'd built in the courtroom was unraveling under the weight of federal suspicion. James Richardson called me at midnight with news that made my stomach drop. The FBI wants to interview Thomas tomorrow morning. They're treating him as a potential co-conspirator in the alleged fraud scheme since he signed over his shares to you. If he doesn't cooperate fully, they'll charge him. Thomas, faced with federal prosecution, broke in ways I don't think he'd broken before. Jennifer sent me the audio of his FBI interview he'd consented to recording and wanted me to hear it. His voice was hollow, defeated, nothing like the patriarch who'd slapped me 3 weeks earlier. I accepted payments from Victor Hartwell totaling $5.2 million over 10 years, Thomas said. He framed them as investment advisory fees, but the real purpose was to buy my compliance. He wanted me to favor Grace over Natalie in company decisions, to distrust Natalie's judgment, to create conflict between my daughters. He threatened to expose Grace's parentage and sue for custody if I didn't cooperate. I was terrified of losing her, so I did what he wanted. The FBI agent asked, "Did you suspect Victor Hartwell was sabotaging Bowen Corp?" Long silence. Then, "Yes, I suspected for years. But I was too much of a coward to confront him because I knew he'd destroy everything if I tried to stop him. When my wife died, I suspected it wasn't accidental. She'd told me she was going to the police about Victor's stalking. But I never pursued it because Victor made it clear that if I caused problems, Grace would pay the price. I chose saving one daughter over protecting both of them, and I've been living with that choice ever since. The confession exonerated me. It proved the company's collapse was due to external sabotage and internal corruption, not my manipulation. But it also revealed that my father had known, had suspected, and had chosen complicity over protection for a decade. He'd watched Victor poison our family and done nothing because he was too weak and too terrified to fight back. The FBI brought Thomas to Bowen Corp the next day to formalize his statement. Grace and I were both there, having been called as witnesses. We waited in the conference room where I'd been slapped, the three of us sitting at the same table where everything had fallen apart. Thomas looked 20 years older. His hands shook as he signed documents. When the agents left us alone for a moment, he turned to face us both and said the first honest thing I'd heard from him in years. "I was a coward who let a monster into our lives because I was too weak to fight him. I don't deserve forgiveness, but you deserve to know I'm sorry." His voice broke. "Your mother tried to protect you both, and I failed her. She told me Victor would destroy us if I didn't stand up to him, and I thought I was being smart by compromising. I was just being weak." Grace reached across the table and took his hand. I didn't. I wasn't ready for that yet, might never be ready for that. The final piece fell into place when Margaret Foster arrived at our attorney's office with the original private investigator's report on my mother's death. The manila envelope contained not just the brake line analysis, but something I hadn't known existed, a partial fingerprint lifted from the severed brake line section. "The police never tested it because they closed the case as accidental," Margaret explained. "But your mother's investigator had it analyzed independently. He kept the results sealed at your mother's request. She was building a criminal case and didn't want to tip off Victor before she had everything ready." The fingerprint analysis report showed a 14-point match to prints on file from Victor's business license application. Combined with his courtroom admission about ensuring the accident wasn't entirely accidental, and Grace's recording where he described brake line tampering, the evidence was overwhelming. James submitted everything to federal prosecutors. The fingerprint analysis, the courtroom transcript, Grace's full recording, Helen Crane's testimony, Thomas's confession, and Rebecca Walsh's statement about Victor celebrating my mother's death. Within 6 hours, the investigation's focus shifted completely. The securities fraud inquiry into me was suspended pending review. A new investigation into Victor was opened for conspiracy to commit murder, obstruction of justice, securities fraud, and corporate espionage. The arrest happened at Westlake Industries headquarters the following morning. Every major news outlet sent cameras. I watched the live footage from my Portsmouth cottage, Victor being led out in handcuffs, surrounded by FBI agents, dozens of employees standing in shocked silence. As Victor was guided toward the waiting vehicle, he turned to face the cameras directly and smiled, not the charming smile he'd used to manipulate Grace, but something colder, more satisfied. He spoke clearly, knowing the microphones would catch every word. "She still doesn't know what her mother really did to deserve this. Ask Elizabeth's old research partner about the patent theft. Ask about who really invented the technology that built Bowen Corp. Some secrets are worth 30 years of vengeance." Then they put him in the car, and he was gone. Victor's cryptic accusation about patent theft haunted me for the 3 days between his arrest and arraignment, but Margaret Foster put those fears to rest within hours. She produced my mother's original research notebooks, 23 volumes spanning her work from 1989 to 2015, every page time-stamped and notarized by independent witnesses quarterly. The innovations that became the foundation of Bowen Corp's technology were all dated between 1996 and 2001, years after my mother had divorced Victor and begun working with Thomas. Whatever Victor believed she'd stolen existed only in his delusional rewriting of history. The arraignment became the public spectacle Victor's lawyers had desperately tried to avoid. Federal prosecutors charged him with conspiracy to commit murder in my mother's death, securities fraud, corporate espionage, stalking, and obstruction of justice. Victor's attorney, clearly operating against better judgment, allowed him to take the stand to explain his perspective. It was a catastrophic miscalculation. Victor stood in the witness box with the same commanding presence he'd used to seduce Grace's trust and manipulate Thomas's fears. But now it came across as arrogance before a judge who'd spent 40 years seeing through exactly this kind of performance. When asked about his relationship with my mother, Victor's carefully constructed facade cracked completely. "She was mine," he said, his voice tight with rage barely contained by decades of practice. "Her mind, her ideas, everything she created during our marriage belonged to me. When she left, she didn't just take herself, she took my future. Elizabeth had brilliance I'd spent years cultivating, and she gave it to that weak fool Thomas Bowen like I'd never existed. Bowen Corp was built on my vision that she stole. I spent 20 years taking back what was rightfully mine." The prosecutor, a sharp woman named Amanda Chen, who'd built her career on white-collar crime cases, let the statement hang in the air before approaching the witness stand with a box of notebooks. "Mr. Hartwell, I'm showing you what's been entered as evidence, Elizabeth Bowen's research journals from 1989 to 2015. Each volume is notarized quarterly by independent witnesses. Can you identify the dates on the innovations you claim she stole from you?" Victor flipped through the notebooks, his face reddening as he realized the trap. Every innovation, every patent, every technological breakthrough that had built Bowen Corp was dated after 1996, years after the divorce. The patents filed during his marriage to my mother were for completely different technologies in unrelated fields. "This doesn't prove anything," Victor said, but his voice lacked conviction. "She could have backdated." "The notarizations are independently verified, Mr. Hartwell. Are you accusing multiple registered notaries of fraud?" He had no answer. The judge, a stern black woman named Patricia Williams, who'd presided over the federal bench for 23 years, looked at Victor with unconcealed disgust. The trial itself took 6 weeks, though I only attended the most critical days. The prosecution presented devastating testimony from 6 people whose companies Victor had destroyed using the same tactics he'd employed against Bowen Corp, cultivating insiders, providing sabotaging advice, then acquiring the collapsed businesses at fire sale prices. A forensic accountant traced $12.3 million Victor had made from these schemes over 2 decades. Margaret Foster presented my mother's documentation of stalking. Rebecca Walsh described Victor's celebration at my mother's death. Grace's recording played in full. The defense tried to paint Victor as a legitimate businessman whose aggressive tactics had been mischaracterized, but the evidence was overwhelming. When the fingerprint analysis proving Victor had tampered with my mother's brake line was admitted, several jurors visibly recoiled. Judge Williams sentenced Victor to 18 years in federal prison, the maximum possible under the charges. She also ordered Westlake Industries to pay $47 million in restitution to the companies Victor had destroyed, effectively bankrupting the firm. As she read the sentence, her voice carried moral weight beyond legal proceedings. "Mr. Hartwell, you have spent decades weaponizing people's trust, exploiting their vulnerabilities, and destroying lives to satisfy your ego and greed. You turned your own daughter into an instrument of revenge against a woman who had every right to escape your control. The harm you've caused extends far beyond financial damages. You've corrupted families, ended careers, and quite possibly committed murder. This court can only address the crimes we can prove, but I want you to understand that your legacy will be one of cruelty, manipulation, and the destruction of everything you claim to value." As marshals prepared to escort Victor from the courtroom, he turned toward the gallery where Grace and I sat together. His eyes locked on Grace, and for a moment, I thought I saw something that might have been regret. Then he spoke, his voice carrying that same contempt he'd always had for weakness. "You were supposed to be my legacy. Instead, you're just as weak as your mother." Grace stood, and I saw her hands were steady. She'd been practicing what she would say if given this moment, and now her voice rang clear through the courtroom. "No, I'm just as strong as my mother. I just had to learn it the hard way. And unlike you, I'm using that strength to build instead of destroy." Victor's face contorted with rage, but the marshals were already moving him toward the door. His last words echoed through the courtroom. "You'll never escape what I made you." "I already have," Grace said quietly and sat down. The case sparked a national conversation that extended far beyond our family. NPR ran a week-long series on corporate predation and psychological manipulation in business. The Harvard Business Review published a case study analyzing how Victor's tactics had gone undetected for so long. 3 different universities requested permission to use the trial transcripts in courses on business ethics and corporate governance. Most importantly, women started coming forward. Former employees of the 6 companies Victor had destroyed, people who'd been blamed for failures that were actually engineered entrepreneurs who'd lost everything to predatory consultants using similar tactics. Within a month, we'd been contacted by 47 women with stories that echoed our own. Grace and I met with our attorneys and established the Women's Business Defense Fund using a portion of the restitution money. The fund provided free legal consultation to women entrepreneurs facing suspicious business relationships, psychological support for those recovering from professional manipulation, and a network of verified business advisors who'd been thoroughly vetted. We named my mother as co-founder posthumously, and her photograph hung in our office alongside the mission statement, supporting women's right to build without being destroyed. Patricia Chen from my investment fund agreed to serve as the fund's executive director. Linda Morrison offered pro bono legal services. Within 3 months, we'd helped 12 women identify and escape predatory business relationships. Within 6 months, the fund was operating in 7 states. For the first time in our lives, Grace and I weren't competing for scraps of approval from a father who'd never learned how to give it. We were building something together, healing by helping others heal, transforming our trauma into protection for people who needed it. But Bowen Corp still needed a future, and I had to decide what that future would look like. With Victor imprisoned and the immediate crisis resolved, I returned to Bowen Corp headquarters for the first time since my resignation, walking through doors that had once felt like entering a battlefield. The building looked the same, but everything felt different. Or perhaps I was different, and that changed how I saw it. Employees who'd once avoided eye contact now stopped to thank me, some with tears in their eyes, for saving us from something we didn't even know we needed saving from. My first act as permanent CEO was establishing an independent ethics board composed of 3 external members with no financial ties to Bowen Corp, a retired federal judge, a business ethics professor from MIT, and a corporate governance expert who'd spent her career investigating fraud. They had authority to investigate any concerns, access to all company records, and direct reporting lines to both me and the full board of directors. No more secrets, no more looking the other way. I implemented a whistleblower protection system that allowed any employee to report concerns anonymously through a third-party service with guaranteed investigation and protection from retaliation. The system went live on a Monday, and by Friday we'd received 17 reports, most minor, but 3 pointing to procurement irregularities that had gone unaddressed for years because people feared speaking up. We investigated all of them. 3 executives who'd known about Helen Crane's relationship with Victor but stayed silent received termination letters. I could have publicly shamed them, could have made examples that would have satisfied my anger, but instead, I offered severance packages and job placement assistance through an HR consulting firm. Accountability didn't require cruelty, and I refused to build my leadership on the same fear-based model that had enabled Victor's infiltration in the first place. The hardest restructuring decision involved the company's mission itself. I gathered every employee, all 340 people in the main assembly area, and asked them a question no one had thought to ask before. What should Bowen Corp actually stand for? We spent 3 months in working groups, cross-departmental teams, and open forums developing an answer. The mission statement we eventually adopted was written collaboratively rather than handed down from executive suite, building technology that empowers independence for underserved populations, particularly women over 45 seniors, and communities historically excluded from technological advancement. It was my mother's values made explicit, my investment fund's philosophy applied at corporate scale, and a direct repudiation of the profit above all approach that had made us vulnerable to Victor's manipulation. Wall Street analysts called it naive and financially risky. Our stock price dipped 4% the day we announced the new mission. I didn't care. I was building for legacy, not quarterly returns. Grace's role in the new Bowen Corps required careful thought. She wanted to help, wanted to prove she could contribute meaningfully, but putting her back in an executive position would have been setting her up for the same kind of failure Victor had exploited. Instead, I created something new, Director of Community Impact and Strategic Partnerships, a role that leveraged her actual strengths rather than forcing her into positions that highlighted her weaknesses. Grace led Bowen Corp's formal partnership with the Women's Business Defense Fund, coordinating between the company's resources and the fund's mission. She spoke at conferences about her experience with manipulation and recovery, becoming the public face of our transformation story. Her talks were raw, honest, and powerful. She didn't shy away from her failures or try to paint herself as a victim, but instead spoke about accountability, healing, and the long work of rebuilding trust. I spent years trying to be you, she told me 6 months into her new role, sitting in my office after a particularly successful conference presentation. Trying to be the technical genius, the strategic thinker, the person who could see 10 steps ahead. It was exhausting, and I was terrible at it. But this helping people, telling our story, building connections between the company and the community, this feels right. This feels like me. It is you, I said. The real you, not the person Victor wanted you to be. The market response to our transformation took 6 months to fully materialize, but when it did, even the skeptical analysts had to acknowledge the results. Lockheed Martin and Northrop Grumman both returned, signing new contracts specifically citing renewed confidence in leadership integrity and organizational stability. Our employee Glassdoor rating jumped from 2.3 stars to 4. 7 stars, and our HR department reported that applications from top-tier engineering talent had increased by 340%. The most surprising development came from Catalyst Ventures, a major venture capital firm specializing in social impact investments. Their managing partner called requesting a meeting, and when we sat down, she said something I'd never expected to hear: "We want to invest in Bowen Corp specifically because of your transformation story. You've proven that a company can survive executive sabotage, family dysfunction, and near bankruptcy by choosing ethics over expediency. That's the kind of resilience we bet on." They offered a strategic partnership worth $35 million, not as a takeover, but as collaborative growth capital. The stock price recovered to pre-crisis levels within 4 months, then exceeded them by 23% over the following 2 months. I gave an interview to the Harvard Business Review where the reporter asked how I'd managed to turn around a company that had been so thoroughly compromised. I thought of my mother, of her journals, of the values she'd tried to instill in a company that had slowly lost its way under my father's fearful leadership. My mother always told me, "You can build an empire on fear, but it will crumble the moment that fear is challenged," I said. "Build on trust, transparency, and genuine value creation, and it becomes a legacy that outlasts any individual." I'm just trying to honor what she knew all along. The reporter published that quote as the article's headline. It generated more positive press than any marketing campaign we could have designed. But for all the professional success, all the restructuring and rebuilding and renewed contracts, there was still one relationship I hadn't fully addressed. Thomas had resigned from the board completely after his FBI testimony, retreating to the family house where he sat alone with the consequences of a decade of cowardice. He hadn't called, hadn't reached out, and I hadn't initiated contact. Grace visited him weekly, working on her own forgiveness in her own time. But I couldn't bring myself to cross that threshold yet. Some wounds needed more time to even begin healing. Until one morning when Margaret Chen called and said simply, "Natalie, your father is in the hospital. I think you should come." Margaret Chen's call came during a quarterly review meeting, and the urgency in her voice made me excuse myself immediately. "It's not life-threatening," she clarified when I asked if I should call an ambulance. "He had a panic attack severe enough that Grace took him to the emergency room. They're keeping him for observation and psychiatric evaluation. Natalie, he's asking for you." I drove to the hospital with conflicting emotions churning through me: worry, Anger, old hurt that hadn't fully healed, and underneath it all, the complicated love for a parent who'd failed me in nearly every way that mattered. When I found his room, Grace was sitting beside his bed holding his hand. She looked up at me with red-rimmed eyes and said, "He wants to talk to you alone." Thomas looked diminished in the hospital bed wearing a gown instead of his usual expensive suits. His silver hair uncombed his face gray with exhaustion, but his eyes were clearer than I'd seen them in years, as if the panic attack had burned through some fog he'd been living in. "Thank you for coming," he said quietly. "I wasn't sure you would." "Grace called me," I said, which wasn't quite an answer but was all I could offer. He nodded, accepting that. "The doctor says I'm having a psychological breakdown delayed by years of avoidance. Apparently holding that much guilt and fear eventually breaks something in your nervous system." He attempted a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Your mother would say I deserve it." "Probably," I said, pulling up a chair but keeping some distance between us. Thomas gestured to a box on the visitor's table, the same box I'd seen him carrying when he'd visited me in Maine, though that felt like a lifetime ago. "I need to give you this before I lose my nerve. It's documentation of every payment I received from Victor over 10 years. $5.2 million total. I've already placed it in an irrevocable trust for the Women's Business Defense Fund. I can't give you back your childhood and I can't bring back your mother, but I can at least make sure the money that destroyed our family helps rebuild others." I opened the box and found meticulous records, bank statements, wire transfer confirmations, even tax documents showing how Thomas had reported the payments as consulting income. The thoroughness of the documentation suggested he'd been preparing this confession for months. "I've been in therapy for 5 months, he continued. "Court-ordered initially, but I've kept going because I finally realized I need help understanding why I made the choices I made. Dr. Reeves, my therapist, says I have a pathological need for control rooted in my father's parenting." He laughed bitterly. "My father raised me to believe a man's worth came from being the smartest person in any room, from dominating conversations, from never showing weakness. When I married your mother, who was genuinely brilliant, I felt emasculated every time she solved a problem I couldn't. I loved her desperately, but part of me resented her intelligence because it made me feel inadequate. I'd never heard my father speak this honestly about his own psychology. It was uncomfortable, revealing, and somehow more painful than his previous denials. When you showed those same qualities, that same brilliant analytical mind, that same competence that made everything look easy, it triggered every insecurity I'd spent my life trying to suppress." Thomas's voice cracked. "I punished you for being what I was supposed to celebrate. Your mother knew it. She tried to tell me I was destroying you by refusing to see you clearly, by always comparing you unfavorably to Grace. She said I was using Grace's neediness to make myself feel powerful because your self-sufficiency made me feel useless." "You were useless," I said, and the words came out harder than I'd intended. "Not because you couldn't solve every problem, but because you refused to acknowledge the problems I did solve. You turned my competence into a character flaw." "I know." He wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, a gesture so uncharacteristically vulnerable it made me look away. "I thought I had time to fix it. Your mother was always better at these things, at seeing people clearly, at naming dysfunction, at demanding change. I kept telling myself I'd deal with my issues after the next project, the next quarter, the next crisis. And then she died, and instead of changing, I just got worse. I clung to Grace harder because losing her felt like losing the last piece of your mother I could control." The honesty was almost too much. I'd spent years imagining confrontations where I'd tell my father exactly how he'd failed me, but now that he was confessing without prompting, I found I didn't have words for the enormity of what had been broken between us. "I needed a father who was proud of me, not intimidated by me," I finally said. "You gave me neither. Every accomplishment was minimized. Every success was attributed to luck or to someone else's help. And every time I needed support, you were too busy managing Grace's latest crisis. You made me feel like loving me and valuing me were mutually exclusive." "They weren't," Thomas said, I did love you. I just didn't know how to show it in ways that didn't feel like I was admitting my own inadequacy. That's not an excuse, it's just the truth I'm finally able to see. I looked at this man who'd given me life but so little else, and I thought about my mother's journal entries. She'd written that Thomas was a good man trapped in bad ideas about masculinity, that his failures came from fear rather than malice, that he was capable of change if he could ever face himself honestly. Mom wrote that you were a good man, I said quietly. I'm choosing to believe her even though you haven't given me much reason to. If you want any kind of relationship with me going forward, you continue therapy. You work on yourself, not for me, but because Grace deserves a father who shows up as healed as possible. And you accept that I may never fully forgive you, and that's my right. I accept those terms, Thomas said without hesitation. I don't deserve forgiveness, Natalie. I just hope that someday you might not hate me quite as much. As I stood to leave, something unexpected came out of my mouth, words I hadn't planned but recognized as true once I spoke them. Mom loved you even when she was frustrated with you. She wrote about it in her journals, how infuriating and exhausting and worthy of love you could be simultaneously. I'm trying to learn how to do that too. I don't know if I can, but I'm trying. Thomas broke down completely, then covering his face with his hands, his shoulders shaking. I left him there with Grace, who'd been waiting outside the door, and slipped back in when she heard him crying. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't reconciliation. It was something more fragile and more honest acknowledgement that healing was possible, even if it would never be complete, and that sometimes the best you can offer broken family is truth instead of pretense. 1 week later, the board would vote on my permanent appointment as CEO, and I would have to decide whether Thomas deserved a seat in that room. The board meeting was scheduled for 9 a.m. on a Tuesday in late autumn, almost exactly 6 months after the slap that had changed everything. I arrived early and stood outside the same conference room where my father had struck me, feeling the weight of every decision that had led from that moment to this one. Grace found me there, touched my shoulder gently, and said, "You ready?" "I think so." I said, though ready felt like an inadequate word for the complicated mixture of emotions I was carrying. When everyone had assembled 11 board members, our attorney and the corporate secretary to record the proceedings, I began with a statement that seemed to surprise most of the room. I hold 51% of Bowen Corp's shares, which legally gives me controlling authority over this company. But I'm asking the board to vote on my permanent appointment as CEO anyway, not because it's required, but because I want leadership affirmed by consensus rather than just ownership. I looked around the table, making eye contact with each director. My mother built part of this company on relationships of trust, on the belief that good leadership came from earning respect rather than demanding it. I want to lead that way too. If you don't believe I'm the right person for this role, tell me now and I'll step aside for someone you do trust. The silence that followed was profound. Finally, Margaret Chen stood, her voice thick with emotion. In 30 years on this board, I've never seen someone with majority control ask for affirmation. I've seen plenty of people leverage ownership into dictatorship, but I've never seen someone with absolute power choose to make it contingent on trust. That's exactly why you deserve it, Natalie. That's exactly the kind of leader your mother was, and exactly the kind of leader this company needs. Richard Sorensen spoke next, adjusting his glasses in that nervous way he had when addressing difficult topics. 6 months ago, I watched this company nearly collapse because we'd stopped asking hard questions and started accepting convenient answers. Natalie, you've rebuilt our financial integrity, restored client confidence, and more importantly, you've created an environment where people feel safe telling the truth. My vote is yes, and it's the easiest vote I've ever cast. Howard Phillips, the oldest board member at 72, cleared his throat. I worked with your grandfather and your mother, Natalie. I watched this company being built on principles that got slowly eroded over the years. When you presented that dossier of evidence about Grace's errors and your corrections, my first reaction was anger at myself for not seeing what was happening, for being complicit in dysfunction, because it was easier than confronting it. You didn't just hold Grace accountable. You held all of us accountable, including yourself. That's integrity. Each board member spoke in turn, their statements creating an unexpected collective reckoning. Patricia Morrison talked about the transformation in employee morale and the flood of applications from top talent. James Rodriguez mentioned the ethics board and whistleblower protections as examples of institutional courage. Even the newest board member, Sarah Kim, who joined during the restructuring, spoke about how Natalie's leadership had made her believe corporations could actually serve purposes beyond shareholder enrichment. When it was Grace's turn, she stood slowly, her hands gripping the back of her chair. I have a non-executive seat on this board because Natalie believed I could contribute meaningfully if given a role that fit my actual abilities, rather than the abilities I pretended to have. 6 months ago, I would have voted against her out of jealousy, insecurity, and the toxic belief that her success somehow diminished me. Her voice steadied as she continued. But I vote for Natalie not because she's my sister, but because she's the leader I tried to pretend to be for years. I spent so long wanting this role, and now I'm profoundly grateful I don't have it. Natalie doesn't just run companies, she transforms them. She transformed this company. She transformed the relationship between us, and she's transforming me into someone who can finally contribute instead of just consume. My vote is yes, and it's the most honest thing I've said in this room in 3 years. The vote was unanimous. Even Thomas, who'd remained silent throughout the testimonials, raised his hand when called upon, the gesture shaky but deliberate. I watched him and saw not the patriarch who'd ruled through fear and favoritism, but a broken man trying to participate in repair he'd never thought possible. After the votes were recorded, Thomas did something that shocked the entire room. He stood, removed the heavy gold signet ring from his right hand, the ring that had belonged to his father and grandfather before him, traditionally passed to the male heir leading Bowen Corp., and walked around the table to where I sat. This ring has been passed down for 3 generations as a symbol of leadership in this family, he said, his voice barely steady. I corrupted what it represented. I let fear and ego turn it into a symbol of patriarchal control rather than responsible stewardship. I don't have the right to wear it anymore. He held it out to me and I saw his hand was shaking. Maybe you can make it mean something good again. Maybe you can make it represent the values your mother tried to build into this company. I took the ring, feeling its unexpected weight. It was too large for any of my fingers, clearly designed for a man's hand, but I didn't need to wear it to understand what Thomas was offering, not power I already held, but symbolic acknowledgement of a transition he should have made years ago. I accept this not as a symbol of patriarchy, I said, looking around the table to make sure everyone understood, but as a promise to honor this company's future over its flawed past. Which brings me to my first major initiative as your formally affirmed CEO. I pulled up the presentation I'd been preparing for weeks. I'm proposing we convert Bowen Corp to a B Corporation structure. This legally requires us to balance profit with social good, to consider stakeholder impact alongside shareholder returns, and to make our mission of empowering independence through technology binding rather than aspirational. It means we'll be held accountable not just to financial metrics, but to social impact metrics. It means our commitment to serving women seniors and underserved communities becomes part of our legal charter. The board members looked at each other, processing the magnitude of what I was proposing. B Corp certification was rigorous, public, and permanent. It would fundamentally change how Bowen Corp operated and how we measured success. Margaret Chen smiled. Your mother would love this. I vote yes. The motion passed unanimously, 10 votes in favor, with Thomas abstaining as he'd agreed to do given his non-voting status. As the meeting adjourned, people stood and shook my hand, some with tears in their eyes, others with expressions of relief that suggested they'd been waiting years for leadership they could actually believe in. Grace hugged me tightly and whispered, "Mom would be so proud of you." I walked back to my office, the corner office that had once felt like a cage that I'd emptied in quiet rebellion 6 months ago, that I'd slowly refurnished with pieces that actually reflected who I was rather than who I was expected to be. The harbor view through the windows looked different now, or perhaps I was different in ways that changed how I saw everything. On my desk sat the ring Thomas had given me catching the afternoon light. I picked it up and examined the engraving inside Bowen, Leadership Through Service. The words my grandfather had chosen, the ideal my mother had embodied, the standard my father had failed to meet, and the challenge I was now accepting as my own. I placed the ring in my desk drawer, not hidden but not displayed, a private reminder of both legacy and transformation. Then I opened my laptop and began drafting the company-wide email announcing our B Corp conversion, explaining what it meant and why it mattered, inviting every employee to help shape what ethical business leadership actually looked like in practice. For the first time in my life, I wasn't building in someone else's shadow or cleaning up someone else's mess. I was creating something new from the ashes of what had been destroyed, and it felt like finally coming home to a place I'd been searching for my entire life. The office that had once been a cage had become a legacy worth building, and I was just getting started. The anniversary of taking control fell on a Saturday in October, exactly 1 year after the emergency board meeting where I demanded 51% or nothing. But before the company celebration, there was somewhere else I needed to be, someone else I needed to speak to, even though she couldn't answer back. I picked up Grace and Thomas early that morning, the three of us driving in unusual silence to the cemetery where my mother had been buried 5 years ago. It was one of those perfect autumn mornings she'd always loved, crisp air, golden light filtering through trees turned bronze and scarlet, the smell of earth and leaves and approaching winter. I carried a leather portfolio containing the signed B Corporation certification documents, official and notarized proof that what my mother had dreamed for Bowen Corp had finally become legally binding reality. We stood together at her grave, the headstone simple granite engraved with her name, and the dates that bracketed a life cut far too short. I knelt and placed the documents against the stone, my hand resting on the cold surface, as if I could somehow transmit everything that had happened in the year since Victor's imprisonment. "Mom, I finished what you started," I said aloud, not caring that cemetery visitors walking past might hear. "Victor is in prison for 18 years. The company is safe, more than safe. It's finally becoming what you wanted it to be. Grace and I are finally sisters instead of rivals. Dad is trying to heal, actually trying, not just saying the words. And I'm building the kind of company you dreamed about, one that helps women like you who had to fight so hard for every inch of respect and still somehow managed to create something beautiful." Grace knelt beside me, her hand finding mine. "I'm sorry I let him use me against you, against all of us," she said, her voice thick with tears. "I was so stupid and so desperate to matter that I let myself become a weapon. But Natalie taught me that being manipulated doesn't mean I can't still choose integrity now. I'm choosing it every day, Mom. I'm trying to be someone you'd be proud of." Thomas stood behind us, and when I glanced back, I saw tears running down his face. "I failed you, Elizabeth," he said, his voice breaking completely. "I failed you in every way that mattered. But our daughters are better than I ever was. They're stronger, braver, more honest. They're building the legacy you deserved to build yourself. You'd be so proud of them." We stayed there for a long time, the three of us bound by grief and hope and the complicated work of becoming a family that could actually love each other honestly. When we finally left, I looked back once and could have sworn I felt something like approval in the autumn air. The anniversary celebration that afternoon was nothing like the corporate galas Thomas used to throw. Instead of renting an expensive hotel ballroom and serving champagne, I'd organized Community Impact Day, all 340 Bowen Corp employees volunteering at 12 different organizations serving women over 45. Some were at job training centers, others at senior technology programs, still others at the Women's Business Defense Fund offices that had expanded to 3 cities. I spent my morning at a workshop teaching older women basic coding skills, watching their faces light up when their first programs executed successfully. The afternoon keynote brought everyone together at a community center. Dr. Patricia Chen, no relation to Margaret, though they'd become friends through my investment network, took the stage as our featured speaker. She was 62, brilliant, and running a successful assistive technology company that had just secured contracts with 8 major hospital networks. 6 years ago, I was 54 years old, recently laid off from a Silicon Valley company that told me I didn't fit the culture anymore. Patricia began, her voice carrying easily through the crowded room. I had an idea for assistive technology that could help seniors maintain independence, but every venture capitalist I pitched told me some version of the same thing: too old, too female, too risky, too niche. I was about to give up when Natalie Bowen, who I'd never met, who had no reason to believe in me, gave me $150,000 in seed funding and said, "I don't invest in sure things. I invest in people who've been told they're not worth the risk because that's where the real innovation happens." The crowd applauded, and I felt my cheeks warm with the attention. "Natalie didn't just give me money," Patricia continued. "She gave me belief. She gave me a network of other women who'd been counted out and decided to count themselves back in. And now my company employs 47 people, holds 12 patents, and helps thousands of seniors live independently. That's what Bowen Corp represents now: not just products, but second chances and earned success. Not just profit, but purpose." The standing ovation lasted nearly 2 minutes. I stood at the back of the room watching employees I'd hired and employees who'd survived the restructuring applaud, not for me specifically, but for what we'd built together. For the first time in my professional life, I felt valued for building up, rather than cleaning up for creating, rather than containing for leading, rather than just managing crisis after crisis. That evening, back in my office, as sunset painted the harbor in shades of copper and rose, I reviewed a strategic proposal Grace had sent me. The document was impressive: a detailed plan for expanding the Women's Business Defense Fund internationally, starting with Canada and the UK, complete with budget projections, partnership strategies, and measurable impact goals. The work was thorough, creative, and realistic. Grace had found her calling. I added a note to the top of the document: "This is brilliant, let's do it together," and sent it back to her. Then I noticed an envelope on my desk that my assistant had marked "Personal" from Federal Correctional Institution. The return address was the prison where Victor was serving his sentence. My hand hovered over it for a moment before I picked it up, felt its weight, and made a decision. I fed the unopened letter into the shredder beside my desk, watching the paper turn into thin strips that could never be reassembled. Whatever Victor had to say, justifications, threats, manipulations, or even apologies, no longer mattered. His voice no longer had power over my choices. He'd stolen enough of my mother's life, and nearly stolen mine. I wasn't giving him another second of my attention. I looked at the framed photograph on my desk, my mother at her desk in this same office 25 years younger, but with the same determined expression I saw in the mirror now. I thought about her journals, her warnings, her desperate attempts to protect us from a predator we hadn't understood we were fighting. "You taught me that strength doesn't mean never being hurt," I said quietly to her image. "It means deciding who gets to define you after they try to break you. I'm choosing to be defined by what I've built, not by what was done to me." I gathered my things and walked through the office toward the exit. Employees smiled genuinely as I passed some waving goodnight others sharing quick updates on projects. The building felt alive in ways it never had during my father's tenure, not with fear or competition, but with genuine collaboration and shared purpose. Grace was waiting in the lobby, having come back from the Community Impact Day site she'd been managing. "Ready to go?" she asked. "Ready," I said. We walked out together into the October evening, two sisters who'd spent most of their lives as rivals, finally learning what it meant to be family. Behind us, Bowen Corp stood not as a monument to patriarchal control or corporate greed, but as proof that women's strength, when unleashed from manipulation and given room to flourish, could transform everything. And I smiled, not the brief, hidden smile from the day of the slap, when I'd known my plan was finally beginning, but something deeper and more genuine, the smile of someone who'd transformed their greatest wound into their most powerful legacy. The empire wasn't built on fear, secrets, or control. It was built on trust, transparency, and the radical belief that doing right by people was not just morally correct, but strategically brilliant. My mother had known that all along. I'd just needed 33 years, a slap of resignation, and a war to finally understand it myself. And that's where Natalie's story ends. But maybe yours is just beginning. If you've ever felt undervalued, overlooked, or trapped in a situation where people refuse to see your worth, drop a comment below. Tell me, what would you do if you were in Natalie's position? Would you have left sooner, or would you have stayed and fought differently? I read every single comment, and your stories matter. If this resonated with you, if you've ever been the person holding everything together, while someone else took the credit, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. We share stories like this every week. Real people, impossible situations, and the moment they finally chose themselves over the people who never chose them. Because sometimes the bravest thing you can do is walk away from people who'll never appreciate you and build something so beautiful they'll spend years regretting what they lost. Thanks for listening. I'll see you in the next one.